Chapter 1: The History of the Opium Trade in Afghanistan. The history of the opium trade in Afghanistan is deeply entwined with the nation's past, shaped by economic, political, and social factors that have made it a central part of the Afghan economy. Opium poppy cultivation in Afghanistan dates back centuries, but its rise as a major global drug trade began in the 20th century, coinciding with the geopolitical shifts that swept through the region. Historically, Afghanistan's mountainous terrain and isolated villages provided ideal conditions for opium poppy cultivation. Farmers in remote areas had limited access to markets and infrastructure, making opium cultivation an attractive option due to its high profitability. Unlike traditional crops, opium poppies could be easily grown in harsh conditions, and their refined product, morphine and heroin, was highly sought after in global markets. As Afghanistan's political landscape remained volatile throughout the 20th century, including periods of civil unrest, foreign invasion, and the rise of warlords, the opium trade flourished as a means of financial survival for many local farmers and armed factions. During the 1970s and 1980s, the Afghan opium trade experienced a significant surge, largely due to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. The Afghan resistance, largely funded and supported by the U.S. and its allies, relied heavily on opium profits to fund their insurgency. As the Soviet Union struggled to maintain control, the drug trade became a crucial financial lifeline for various mujahideen groups. The American CIA reportedly turned a blind eye to the trade, focusing instead on the larger strategic objective of defeating the Soviet forces. During this period, Afghanistan became one of the world's largest producers of opium, a status it would retain for many years to come. Following the Soviet withdrawal in 1989, Afghanistan entered a period of civil war, and the opium trade continued to grow, with different factions vying for control over its lucrative profits. By the mid-1990s, the Taliban emerged as a powerful force, further consolidating Afghanistan's role in the global drug trade. Initially, the Taliban sought to suppress opium cultivation in the late 1990s as part of their attempts to gain international legitimacy. However, by the time they regained control of Afghanistan in the early 2000s, opium production had reached unprecedented levels, funding their operations and influencing the trajectory of the ongoing conflict. The opium trade has played an undeniable role in shaping the history and development of modern Afghanistan. It has acted as a significant source of income for both farmers and armed groups, while also fueling the broader geopolitical dynamics of the region. As a result, the history of the opium trade in Afghanistan cannot be separated from the political, social, and military history of the country itself. Origins of the opium cultivation in Afghanistan. Opium cultivation in Afghanistan has ancient roots, with the practice believed to have originated centuries ago, long before the region became known globally for its role in the illicit drug trade. The country's ideal growing conditions, fertile soil, arid climate, and high altitude, have long supported the cultivation of Papaver somniferum, the opium poppy. Initially, opium was valued not for its recreational effects, but for its medicinal properties, used in traditional medicine for pain relief and as a sedative. Historical evidence suggests that opium poppy cultivation was already practiced in parts of Central and South Asia as far back as the time of the Silk Road, when Afghanistan acted as a crucial crossroads between the East and the West. Traders, caravans, and migrating peoples likely introduced and spread the cultivation techniques across the region. However, large-scale production did not begin until much later. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, Afghanistan's opium output remained modest compared to that of British-controlled India or China. Nonetheless, Afghan tribes and rural communities continued cultivating opium for domestic use and local trade. The transformation of Afghanistan from a relatively minor player in the global opium scene into the world's leading producer was a gradual process that began in earnest during the 20th century. The collapse of centralized governance, particularly during the 1970s, created a power vacuum in many rural regions, which allowed opium cultivation to expand unchecked. At the time, farmers began growing poppies not just as a traditional crop, but as a reliable cash commodity that could be exchanged for basic necessities and protection from local warlords. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 marked a turning point in the scale and organization of opium production. The ensuing war devastated the country's agricultural infrastructure and disrupted legitimate economic activity, pushing many rural communities further toward poppy cultivation as a means of survival. Foreign support to resistance groups, often with little oversight, also allowed the trade to grow. With minimal state presence and a fragmented society, cultivation became deeply embedded in the fabric of Afghan rural life. By the 1990s, opium was no longer a supplementary crop. It was a dominant force in Afghanistan's agricultural economy. It was during this period that Afghanistan surpassed countries like Myanmar and Laos to become the world's top opium producer. The roots of this dominance lie not only in ideal environmental conditions, but in the historical, political, and economic pathways that made opium cultivation a rational and often necessary choice for countless Afghan farmers. The role of the opium trade in Afghanistan's economy. The opium trade has long served as a cornerstone of Afghanistan's informal economy, providing critical income in a country where poverty, instability, and limited state infrastructure have hindered economic development. For many rural communities, opium poppy cultivation is not just a source of livelihood, it is often the only viable option. The trade has created a parallel economy that at times has overshadowed the formal sectors, playing a complex role in both sustaining and undermining Afghanistan's broader economic landscape. In rural Afghanistan, where employment opportunities are scarce and government services minimal or absent, opium cultivation offers immediate and relatively high returns compared to legal crops like wheat or barley. The crop is easy to grow, resistant to drought, and has a longer shelf life than perishable goods, making it particularly appealing in areas without adequate storage or transport infrastructure. The guaranteed demand for opium also removes much of the market uncertainty that plagues legal agriculture in the country. At its peak, the opium trade has accounted for a significant portion of Afghanistan's GDP. Estimates from various international bodies have placed it as high as 20 to 30% in certain years. This includes direct income to farmers, as well as profits made by traffickers, warlords, and corrupt officials. The trade fuels not just farming but entire networks of labor, transport, and processing, offering employment to thousands in an otherwise fragile economy. Local markets benefit from the influx of cash during the harvest and trade seasons, further embedding opium into the social and financial rhythms of rural life. However, the economic benefits of the opium trade come with serious long-term costs. The reliance on an illicit crop discourages the development of legal industries and infrastructure. It fosters corruption at all levels of governance, from local police to national political figures, and creates incentives for conflict, as different groups seek to control production and trafficking routes. The drug economy also makes Afghanistan more vulnerable to international sanctions and limits foreign investment, further isolating the country from the global economy. Moreover, the opium economy has trapped many farmers in cycles of debt and dependency. Informal lenders, often tied to trafficking networks, provide upfront cash in exchange for future harvests, locking farmers into exploitative arrangements. This dynamic reinforces poverty and weakens community resilience against economic shocks or climate events. In sum, while the opium trade has filled a critical economic void in Afghanistan, it has done so at a great cost to the nation's legal economy, governance, and long-term development. Its role in the Afghan economy is both indispensable and deeply problematic, symbolizing the country's struggle between survival and stability. Key players in the opium supply chain. The opium supply chain in Afghanistan is a complex and multi-layered network that includes a variety of actors, each playing a distinct role in transforming raw opium into refined narcotics and facilitating its movement across borders. This illicit economy is not controlled by a single entity, but rather supported by an interdependent system of growers, traffickers, processors, insurgents, and corrupt officials. Together, they form a resilient structure that has sustained the opium trade for decades. At the base of the supply chain are the opium poppy farmers. These individuals, often small-scale landowners or sharecroppers, cultivate poppy plants as their primary source of income. In rural Afghanistan, particularly in provinces such as Helmand, Nangarhar, and Badakhshan, these farmers operate in environments with little to no state support. Due to the high profitability of opium and a lack of viable alternatives, they are often locked into cycles of dependence on the crop. Many take loans from local financiers or drug middlemen in exchange for a portion of their future harvest, creating a system of economic entrapment. Above the farmers are the local collectors and traders. These intermediaries purchase raw opium from farmers and organize its transport to processing labs or market hubs. They often maintain long-standing relationships within rural communities, which helps them exert influence and control over the initial stages of the trade. Some of these traders also function as financiers, providing seeds, fertilizers, or cash advances to ensure loyalty and supply. Processing laboratories represent the next critical link. These facilities, often hidden in remote or mountainous areas, convert raw opium into morphine base or heroin. The chemical processes involved require specific knowledge and materials, which are frequently sourced through smuggling networks. The labs are typically operated by organized crime groups or insurgent factions who profit from refining the drug and selling it at a much higher value than raw opium. Insurgent groups, most notably the Taliban during both their pre-2001 regime and in the years following, have played a significant role in protecting and profiting from the opium trade. While not always directly involved in cultivation or processing, they impose taxes on farmers, laboratories, and traffickers, effectively operating as gatekeepers who guarantee the movement and security of narcotics in return for financial gain. At the highest level of the supply chain are international trafficking syndicates. These organizations manage the transport of heroin out of Afghanistan, using a network of couriers, smugglers, and corrupt border officials. The drugs are routed through neighboring countries such as Pakistan, Iran, and the Central Asian republics before reaching markets in Europe, Russia, and beyond. This interconnected web of participants illustrates how the opium trade in Afghanistan is not just a local or national issue, it is a global enterprise, sustained by a wide range of actors with intersecting interests in profit and power. Chapter 2: The Rise of Drug Cartels and Trafficking Networks. The rise of drug cartels and trafficking networks in Afghanistan is a direct consequence of prolonged conflict, weak state institutions, and the lucrative nature of the opium trade. While Afghanistan has long been a major producer of raw opium, the organization of that production into structured criminal enterprises capable of refining, trafficking, and distributing narcotics on a global scale represents a significant evolution in the drug trade. This transformation has turned local actors into powerful drug lords and has tied Afghanistan into the international web of narcotics trafficking. In the early stages of the opium boom, trafficking was relatively uncoordinated, handled by small-scale traders who moved raw opium within and across provincial boundaries. However, as the trade expanded, particularly during the Soviet-Afghan War, more organized and hierarchical networks began to emerge. These groups understood the value of controlling not just the cultivation, but also the processing and export routes. With the collapse of central authority during the Civil War of the 1990s, these emerging cartels were able to operate with near impunity, amassing wealth and power that rivaled or even exceeded that of local governments. Unlike the highly centralized drug cartels seen in countries like Mexico or Colombia, Afghanistan's trafficking networks tend to be more decentralized and clan-based, often operating through tribal affiliations or regional loyalties. Still, they display sophisticated organization, with distinct roles assigned to producers, transporters, processors, and financiers. Some of these networks are rooted in long-standing smuggling traditions that predate the drug trade and have simply adapted to the rising demand for heroin in global markets. Many of these trafficking networks forged alliances with militant groups to secure protection and facilitate movement across conflict zones. The Taliban, in particular, struck deals with traffickers to tax and shield their operations in exchange for a share of the profits. These partnerships enabled drug cartels to operate labs and smuggling routes even in areas under military conflict. Over time, these arrangements evolved into mutually beneficial ecosystems, where insurgent financing and drug trafficking became intertwined. International pressure and sporadic law enforcement crackdowns have done little to disrupt these networks in the long term. In fact, the threat of eradication or interdiction has often driven trafficking operations deeper underground, making them harder to detect and dismantle. Corruption within Afghan security forces and border control agencies further compounds the problem, as traffickers are frequently able to bribe their way through checkpoints or obtain protection from high-ranking officials. Today, these trafficking networks are deeply entrenched, not only in Afghanistan's economy, but also in its power structures. Their resilience and adaptability have allowed them to survive regime changes, military interventions, and shifting alliances, making them a formidable force in both the regional and global drug economy. Formation of Afghan drug cartels. The formation of Afghan drug cartels was not an overnight development, but rather a gradual process shaped by decades of war, political fragmentation, and economic desperation. In the absence of a strong central government, Afghanistan became fertile ground for organized criminal networks to emerge, grow, and entrench themselves within the country's informal economy. These cartels evolved from loosely connected smuggling operations into well-organized syndicates that now dominate the production, processing, and distribution of opiates. During the Soviet invasion in the 1980s, traditional governance structures in Afghanistan began to collapse, creating a power vacuum that was quickly filled by local warlords and tribal leaders. Many of these groups turned to the drug trade as a reliable source of funding to support their militias and sustain their control over territories. What began as opportunistic involvement in opium trafficking gradually became institutionalized. These leaders, familiar with local customs and networks, began to systematize the trade, establishing processing labs, organizing armed protection, and coordinating with smugglers to move product beyond Afghanistan's borders. The civil war that followed the Soviet withdrawal only deepened the role of the drug trade in sustaining armed factions. With no national oversight and an economy in ruins, these groups expanded their narcotics operations, and their smuggling activities became more structured. By the mid-1990s, proto-cartel structures had formed, networks capable of overseeing the entire supply chain from poppy cultivation to international distribution. These were not cartels in the Western sense of hierarchical mega-organizations, but rather decentralized and adaptable alliances of tribal leaders, smugglers, and financiers bound by mutual benefit. The Taliban's rise to power in 1996 further influenced the development of Afghan drug cartels. While the Taliban initially imposed strict regulations and briefly banned opium cultivation in 2000, their enforcement was inconsistent and often politically motivated. In many regions under Taliban control, they struck deals with drug traffickers to allow production in exchange for taxation. These arrangements encouraged traffickers to organize more formally, secure in the knowledge that they could operate with some level of protection and predictability. International demand for Afghan heroin accelerated the cartelization process. As profits soared, competition increased, and groups began investing in more sophisticated logistics, including cross-border transport networks, processing infrastructure, and bribery systems to ensure safe passage. Afghan cartels built relationships with criminal organizations in Pakistan, Iran, Central Asia, and even Europe, integrating themselves into a global narcotics trade. By the early 2000s, Afghan drug cartels had become a central force in the country's shadow economy. They operated across regions, paid off officials, and used violence and coercion to protect their interests. These cartels continue to evolve, demonstrating resilience and adaptability in the face of international interventions, regime changes, and shifting alliances. Routes and methods of opium smuggling. The smuggling of opium and its derivatives out of Afghanistan is a sophisticated operation involving a variety of routes and methods, all designed to evade detection and ensure the narcotics reach international markets. Given Afghanistan's landlocked geography and porous borders, traffickers have developed intricate systems that rely on geographic knowledge, local cooperation, and technological adaptation. The routes used span across continents, linking the poppy fields of rural Afghanistan to urban centers in Europe, Asia, and beyond. The most prominent trafficking route is the so-called Balkan route, which carries Afghan heroin through Iran, Turkey, and the Balkans before reaching Western Europe. This path has been active since the 1970s and remains a dominant corridor, despite increased international interdiction efforts. It benefits from established criminal networks across the region and corrupt border officials who enable the smooth flow of narcotics in exchange for bribes. The Balkan route is often favored for its infrastructure, roads, commercial trucking systems, and seaports that allow heroin to blend into the movement of legitimate goods. Another key route is the Northern Route, which passes through Central Asian countries such as Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan, then into Russia. This path gained prominence as traffickers sought alternatives when other routes became riskier due to intensified security measures. The Northern Route is particularly difficult to police due to the region's rugged terrain and the presence of extensive smuggling networks that predate the opium boom. This route plays a crucial role in supplying heroin to Russia and other parts of Eastern Europe where demand is high. The Southern Route, sometimes referred to as the Sea Route, involves smuggling heroin through Pakistan to the Arabian Sea, from where it is shipped to Africa, the Middle East, or Southeast Asia. Ports in Karachi and Gwadar are known hubs for this route, with heroin often concealed within legal cargo, such as textiles or agricultural products. Traffickers use shipping containers, fishing vessels, and even luxury yachts to move large quantities of narcotics while minimizing the risk of detection. Smuggling methods have grown increasingly sophisticated over the years. On land, traffickers use convoys of trucks, hidden compartments in passenger vehicles, and even livestock as means of concealment. On foot, couriers known as mules carry small amounts across mountain passes, sometimes using donkeys or camels. In urban settings, drugs are disguised as household products, compressed into soap bars, or dissolved in liquids to escape detection by authorities and drug-sniffing dogs. These smuggling operations are supported by corruption, local alliances, and technology such as GPS mapping, encrypted communications, and drone surveillance to monitor border patrols. As interdiction efforts intensify, traffickers continue to adapt, shifting routes and techniques to stay ahead, making the opium smuggling trade one of the most resilient illicit enterprises in the world. International networks and connections to the global market. Afghanistan's opium trade is not an isolated phenomenon confined within its borders. It is deeply embedded in a global network of drug trafficking, economic exchange, and criminal collaboration. The international nature of this trade is a result of both the high global demand for heroin and the strategic partnerships forged between Afghan traffickers and foreign criminal syndicates. These connections have transformed Afghanistan from a national producer into a key player in the global narcotics economy. Once heroin is processed in Afghanistan's clandestine laboratories, it enters a web of international trafficking routes that span continents. Afghan drug cartels rely heavily on their relationships with criminal organizations in neighboring countries, such as Pakistan and Iran, who act as intermediaries and facilitators. These networks manage logistics, secure storage, transportation, and border crossings, often using corruption and bribery to bypass law enforcement. In Pakistan, for example, well-established mafia groups provide access to ports and smuggling infrastructure, enabling heroin to reach destinations across the Middle East, Africa, and Southeast Asia. In Iran, the trafficking trade intersects with networks that connect Central Asia and the Caucasus to European markets. The heroin that leaves Afghanistan often changes hands multiple times, with each stage of transit involving a different set of actors, from regional warlords and smugglers to international cartels and money laundering operatives. These alliances are not always stable. They shift based on profits, politics, and enforcement pressure, but their collective efficiency has allowed Afghan heroin to penetrate nearly every corner of the global market. European criminal organizations, particularly in the Balkans and Western Europe, play a significant role in receiving and distributing heroin. These groups purchase bulk shipments and break them down for street-level distribution. Cities like Rotterdam, Antwerp, and Hamburg serve as major transit hubs for heroin entering Europe, often hidden within shipping containers. From there, heroin is distributed across major urban centers through well-coordinated supply chains. Financial systems also support these international connections. Money laundering operations funnel drug profits through legitimate businesses, real estate, and offshore accounts, making it difficult to trace the origin of funds. Hawala networks, informal value transfer systems popular in South Asia and the Middle East, are often used to move money discreetly, further complicating international enforcement efforts. The global opium economy thrives on instability, demand, and the ability of these networks to evolve. From village-level producers to transnational syndicates, the actors involved in Afghanistan's opium trade are tightly linked to broader global systems of crime and commerce. Disrupting these international connections remains one of the most significant challenges in addressing the full scope of the opium crisis. Chapter 3: The Impact of Opium on the Afghan War. The opium trade has played a deeply influential role in the course of the Afghan War, shaping its financing, alliances, and duration in ways that few other economic factors have. Far beyond being just an agricultural product, opium became a strategic asset, fueling the conflict from all sides and turning Afghanistan's vast poppy fields into battlegrounds of both ideological and economic struggle. The entwinement of narcotics and warfare in Afghanistan has contributed to a vicious cycle of violence, corruption, and underdevelopment. One of the most significant impacts of opium on the Afghan war was its role in funding insurgency. As international forces entered Afghanistan following the fall of the Taliban in 2001, the group rapidly reorganized, drawing upon the opium trade as a primary source of revenue. Through a system of informal taxation, the Taliban collected payments from poppy farmers, traffickers, and processing facilities operating in the regions they controlled or influenced. This steady flow of funds allowed them to purchase weapons, recruit fighters, and sustain prolonged insurgent campaigns against Afghan and coalition forces. For the Afghan government, the opium economy proved both a challenge and a temptation. On one hand, opium undermined efforts to build a stable and legitimate state. The drug trade fostered widespread corruption, with officials, police, and even members of the military accused of accepting bribes or directly participating in trafficking. On the other hand, attempts to eradicate opium often backfired. Poor farmers dependent on the crop for survival viewed eradication campaigns as unjust and punitive, which in turn drove them closer to the insurgents who offered protection or at least turned a blind eye to their cultivation. The international military presence further complicated the situation. NATO and U.S. forces, wary of alienating rural populations, were often reluctant to enforce opium bans, especially early in the conflict. Later efforts to interdict the trade were met with limited success, and sometimes created new enemies among local communities. Meanwhile, international funds aimed at promoting alternative livelihoods often failed due to poor implementation, lack of infrastructure, and insecurity in key agricultural regions. Opium also affected the war's dynamics by distorting local power structures. Warlords and tribal leaders who could secure opium routes or control processing sites gained immense influence, becoming de facto rulers of certain regions. This militarization of the drug trade blurred the lines between political authority, economic interest, and criminal activity, weakening any centralized attempt to establish law and order. Ultimately, opium did not just fund one side of the Afghan war, it embedded itself into the very framework of the conflict. Its profitability incentivized war over peace, exploitation over governance, and short-term gain over long-term stability, ensuring that the war endured not just as a political struggle, but as an economic engine powered by narcotics. Opium as a source of funding for warlords. Throughout Afghanistan's decades of conflict, opium has served as a vital financial lifeline for the country's warlords, enabling them to build private armies, consolidate power, and operate independently of any central government. The collapse of state institutions and the fragmentation of the country during the Soviet invasion and subsequent civil war created the perfect environment for regional strongmen to rise. Lacking consistent international backing or state resources, many turned to the opium trade as the most reliable and lucrative means of financing their operations. Warlords in Afghanistan often controlled large swaths of territory, especially in rural or mountainous areas where central authority was weakest. In these regions, they acted as both governors and military commanders, wielding influence through a combination of force, patronage, and strategic alliances. The cultivation of opium poppy, which flourished in the fertile valleys of provinces like Helmand, Nangarhar, and Badakhshan, quickly became a cornerstone of their economic power. They taxed farmers, controlled processing labs, and established protection rackets that ensured their continued dominance. With profits from the opium trade, warlords could afford to pay militias, purchase weapons, and bribe officials. These revenues allowed them to maintain control over contested areas and defend their interests against rivals or government forces. In some cases, warlords established direct connections with international trafficking networks, turning them into powerful figures not only within Afghanistan, but in the broader regional drug economy. Their influence extended beyond the battlefield and into politics, where some managed to secure formal roles within the Afghan government, further blurring the lines between state authority and criminal enterprise. The reliance on opium also influenced the behavior of these warlords. Their primary interest was often not ideological, but economic. Peace threatened their revenue streams, while ongoing instability allowed them to justify their control and operations. In this way, the drug trade perpetuated the cycle of violence and instability that has plagued Afghanistan for decades. Attempts by international forces or the Afghan state to curtail opium production often met resistance from these powerful figures, who viewed eradication efforts as direct threats to their power base. Moreover, warlords frequently undermined state-building efforts. Their control over local economies, including opium, gave them leverage over the population and allowed them to challenge government initiatives. In regions where they were strongest, law enforcement and judicial systems were often subordinated to their will. This created parallel structures of governance, with opium at the center of both authority and resistance. In essence, opium transformed warlords from regional actors into powerful political and military brokers. It gave them the means to survive, thrive, and even influence national policy, embedding the narcotics trade deeply into Afghanistan's complex web of conflict, governance, and survival. The Taliban and opium production. The Taliban's relationship with opium production has been complex, strategic, and deeply influential in shaping both their military capabilities and political leverage. While publicly the group has often condemned drug use and portrayed itself as adhering to Islamic principles, in practice, the Taliban has relied heavily on the opium economy to finance its operations and expand its influence throughout Afghanistan. During the Taliban's first period of rule from 1996 to 2001, they initially tolerated, and in some areas even encouraged, opium cultivation. It provided essential revenue for a regime that was internationally isolated and economically constrained. Local commanders taxed poppy farmers and traffickers, collecting a percentage of the profits in exchange for allowing them to operate freely. These funds were used to pay fighters, purchase weapons, and maintain administrative control over vast territories. In 2000, the Taliban shocked the international community by imposing a ban on opium cultivation, citing religious reasons. This led to a dramatic, though temporary, decline in production. However, many analysts believe the move was politically motivated, aimed at gaining international legitimacy and possibly pressuring global actors to ease sanctions or provide recognition. The Taliban never dismantled the infrastructure of the opium economy. Instead, they maintained relationships with traffickers and stockpiled opium, potentially profiting from the subsequent price surge that followed the ban. After the US-led invasion in 2001, the Taliban regrouped as an insurgent force and re-engaged with the drug trade more aggressively. As the central government struggled to assert control, the Taliban capitalized on the rural population's dependence on opium for livelihood. They offered protection from eradication campaigns and provided incentives to farmers in return for taxes and loyalty. In some cases, they directly oversaw the establishment of heroin processing labs, increasing the value they could extract from the drug supply chain. The Taliban's involvement in opium production continued to grow during the 2 decades of war, with the group reportedly earning hundreds of millions of dollars annually from the trade. This financial backbone allowed them to sustain a long-term insurgency against Afghan and international forces. Their control over key poppy-producing provinces, like Helmand and Kandahar, gave them strategic advantages both economically and militarily. Following the Taliban's return to power in 2021, they again announced a ban on opium cultivation in 2022. While there were signs of enforcement, particularly in areas under direct control, questions remain about the sincerity and longevity of such policies. Economic desperation, lack of alternative livelihoods, and entrenched trafficking networks make eradication extremely difficult. Despite public proclamations, the Taliban's historical dependence on opium suggests that the crop will likely continue to play a role in their governance and survival. The link between drug revenue and militancy. The connection between drug revenue and militancy is one of the most powerful forces sustaining insurgencies and armed groups, particularly in Afghanistan. For groups like the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and other militant factions, the illicit drug trade has provided a critical source of funding, allowing them to bypass traditional financial systems, which are often inaccessible due to international sanctions and blockades. This financial independence from state actors has made it exceedingly difficult for governments and international organizations to disrupt these militant groups, as they rely on a network of drug revenues to fuel their operations, recruit fighters, and sustain their ideologies. In Afghanistan, the drug trade has been intricately linked with militancy for decades. Opium, as the country's primary illicit export, has provided insurgent groups with the funds necessary to purchase weapons, equipment, and training. It also helps maintain their influence over rural populations, where the cultivation of opium is a vital economic activity. For these groups, drug revenue is not just a means of financial survival, it is also a tool for gaining local loyalty and support. Insurgent leaders can offer protection to farmers or even act as intermediaries in the illicit drug supply chain, creating a symbiotic relationship where the group benefits from both financial and popular support. In the case of the Taliban, their engagement with the drug trade was particularly pronounced. The group initially relied on opium production to fund their insurgency against the US-backed Afghan government and NATO forces. With control over large swaths of rural Afghanistan, particularly in poppy-producing provinces such as Helmand, the Taliban managed to extract significant revenues from the cultivation, processing, and smuggling of heroin. This income enabled them to sustain their insurgency, recruit fighters, and maintain a network of arms suppliers who were otherwise unreachable due to Afghanistan's unstable political environment. The link between drug money and militancy also explains the resilience of these armed groups, even in the face of international efforts to curb the drug trade. Interdiction campaigns and poppy eradication programs, often funded by Western governments, have had limited success in eradicating drug cultivation, in part because the militants had already established a robust infrastructure to move drugs across borders. Drug revenue gave insurgents the resources to adapt, shift tactics, and even recruit from within the ranks of the local populations suffering under the same economic system that the drug trade perpetuates. As long as drug revenue remains a primary funding source, insurgent groups will continue to wield significant power in conflict zones like Afghanistan. The economic foundation provided by illicit drugs allows them to outlast efforts at stabilization or peace-building, and perpetuates cycles of violence, making it a central factor in understanding the complex dynamics of militancy and war. Chapter 4: Global Involvement and Responses. The opium trade in Afghanistan has been a significant concern for the global community, drawing involvement from various international actors and organizations. The far-reaching effects of this illicit industry, which has fueled insurgencies, corruption, and organized crime, prompted responses from a range of stakeholders, including foreign governments, international institutions, and non-governmental organizations. Their efforts to curb the production, trafficking, and consumption of Afghan heroin have shaped the course of the Afghan war and the broader geopolitical dynamics of the region. One of the most prominent global responses to Afghanistan's drug trade has been led by the United States and its NATO allies. Following the 2001 invasion and the subsequent ousting of the Taliban, the U.S. and its partners prioritized counter-narcotics efforts as part of their broader strategy to stabilize Afghanistan. This included significant funding for poppy eradication programs, such as the aerial spraying of herbicides, which were intended to reduce the cultivation of opium poppy. However, these efforts were met with limited success and widespread criticism. The eradication programs often faced opposition from local farmers who depended on opium for their livelihood. In many cases, the destruction of poppy crops without providing viable alternatives led to increased poverty and resentment toward foreign forces, creating fertile ground for insurgents to recruit. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, UNODC, has also played a key role in addressing Afghanistan's drug trade. The UNODC's approach has been more multifaceted, focusing not only on eradication but also on capacity building, law enforcement support, and efforts to provide alternative livelihoods for farmers. Despite these efforts, the scale of the problem has often overwhelmed international responses. Afghanistan remains the world's largest producer of opium, accounting for approximately 80% of global heroin production, which makes it a significant challenge for international organizations to address effectively. Regional actors have been both participants in and victims of the opium trade. Neighboring countries like Pakistan, Iran, and Central Asian states have been key transit routes for Afghan heroin, leading to direct involvement in anti-narcotics initiatives. Pakistan, for instance, has worked with the U.S. and NATO to curb drug trafficking across its border with Afghanistan, yet these efforts have been hindered by porous borders, corruption, and security challenges. Iran, facing a growing heroin addiction crisis due to the influx of Afghan heroin, has been active in border control and anti-smuggling operations, often with mixed results. In addition to these governmental responses, NGOs have sought to address the humanitarian and social aspects of Afghanistan's drug problem. Organizations focused on drug addiction, public health, and education have provided services to vulnerable populations affected by the opium trade. However, the persistent insecurity and lack of resources in many regions have made their work exceedingly difficult. Despite the significant global efforts to curb Afghanistan's opium production and trafficking, the results have been mixed. The drug trade continues to thrive, driven by economic necessity, political instability, and the resilience of organized criminal networks. The complexity of the issue requires coordinated international responses that address both the supply and demand for illicit drugs, as well as the socio-political factors that sustain the opium economy. The role of international forces in fighting drug trafficking. International forces, particularly those led by the United States and NATO, have played a crucial role in the efforts to combat drug trafficking in Afghanistan. After the 2001 invasion, which led to the ousting of the Taliban, the fight against narcotics became a central part of the military and humanitarian mission. The underlying goal was not only to curb the production and distribution of opium, but also to disrupt the financing of insurgent groups, including the Taliban, who relied heavily on the drug trade to fund their operations. The U.S. and NATO forces took a multifaceted approach to counter narcotics operations in Afghanistan. One of the primary strategies was to target the supply chain of opium from cultivation to processing to trafficking. Military operations aimed at disrupting heroin laboratories, seizing drug shipments, and neutralizing high-profile traffickers were central to this effort. Special operations forces worked alongside Afghan security units to raid drug processing labs and arrest traffickers in key poppy-producing regions, particularly in Helmand and Kandahar provinces, which have been significant hubs for opium production. Another key component of international involvement was the establishment of counter-narcotics units within the Afghan National Police and Afghan National Army. These units received training and support from NATO forces to enhance their capacity to combat the drug trade within the country. Despite this, the effectiveness of local law enforcement in curbing drug trafficking was limited by factors such as corruption, lack of resources, and the strong influence of drug lords in many regions. International forces worked to build institutional capacity, but local political and economic dynamics often hindered long-term success. International forces also focused on poppy eradication efforts, with the belief that reducing the supply of raw opium would diminish the capacity of insurgents to profit from the drug trade. These operations, including aerial spraying of herbicides and manual eradication by Afghan farmers under government oversight, were controversial. While they did succeed in reducing poppy cultivation in certain areas, they often faced resistance from local farmers who depended on opium as their primary source of income. This created a backlash, where communities that were alienated by eradication campaigns often turned to insurgent groups for protection, thus inadvertently reinforcing the insurgency. Moreover, the complex relationship between international forces and Afghan farmers highlighted the challenges in addressing the root causes of opium production. International strategies were often criticized for not offering sufficient support for alternative livelihoods for farmers. Many anti-drug efforts failed to address the deeper economic vulnerabilities of rural populations, which made them reliant on the opium trade as a survival mechanism. Despite the substantial resources invested and the efforts made by international forces, the results of these counter-narcotics strategies have been mixed. Afghanistan remains the world's largest producer of opium, and the Taliban in particular continues to profit from the drug trade. This underscores the difficulty of combating the interconnected issues of drug trafficking, insurgency, and poverty in a war-torn country. Ultimately, while international forces have had some success in targeting aspects of the drug trade, a comprehensive solution requires addressing the broader socio-political and economic factors that sustain the opium economy. Diplomatic and military efforts to combat the opium trade. The global community has long recognized the destructive impact of Afghanistan's opium trade, not just on the country itself, but on regional and global security. As one of the world's largest producers of opium, Afghanistan's illicit drug economy has been a major source of funding for insurgents, particularly the Taliban, and a destabilizing force in international drug markets. In response, both diplomatic and military efforts have been implemented by various countries and organizations to disrupt the drug trade, with mixed results. The military response, led primarily by the United States and NATO forces, focused on eradicating poppy cultivation, dismantling drug trafficking networks, and targeting heroin production facilities. Special operations forces were deployed to raid drug labs and disrupt the flow of heroin through smuggling routes, especially in the southern and western provinces, which were the main sources of opium production. Military operations, however, often faced challenges. Local resistance, entrenched corruption, and the logistical difficulties of operating in rural mountainous regions meant that eradication efforts had limited success. In many cases, poppy farmers, who relied on the opium trade for their livelihood, viewed eradication campaigns as foreign impositions that only worsened their economic hardship. The diplomatic efforts to combat Afghanistan's drug trade involved a combination of international cooperation and regional collaboration. The United Nations, through the UNODC, United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, has played a central role in supporting Afghanistan's counter-narcotics efforts, providing technical assistance, training, and financial aid. The UNODC also sought to promote alternative livelihoods for farmers and supported anti-trafficking laws, law enforcement, and judicial reforms. However, despite these efforts, the root causes of opium production, such as poverty, lack of infrastructure, and limited state authority, have continued to hinder progress. In addition to international organizations, neighboring countries, including Pakistan and Iran, have played crucial roles in both combating and at times being affected by the opium trade. Afghanistan's porous borders have made it difficult to control the flow of narcotics. Diplomatic agreements between Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran, aimed at better border control and intelligence sharing, were part of the response to curb trafficking. However, these efforts were often undermined by local corruption, the presence of organized crime syndicates, and ongoing political instability. Despite decades of combined diplomatic and military efforts, Afghanistan remains a major source of the world's opium. The complexity of the problem, rooted in political instability, poverty, and the global demand for heroin, has made it nearly impossible to eradicate the opium trade entirely. Ultimately, while military operations and diplomatic initiatives have had some success, a more comprehensive approach that includes economic development, governance reform, and regional cooperation is necessary to address the deep-seated issues that sustain the opium trade. Challenges faced by the UN and NATO in counter-narcotics. The United Nations, UN, and NATO have faced numerous challenges in their efforts to combat the opium trade in Afghanistan. Despite significant financial investments, strategic initiatives, and military operations, these international organizations have struggled to make lasting progress in curbing the cultivation and trafficking of opium. Several factors, ranging from logistical difficulties to complex socio-political dynamics, have hindered the effectiveness of their counter-narcotics efforts. One of the primary challenges is the sheer scale of opium production in Afghanistan. The country has consistently been the world's largest producer of opium, accounting for around 80% of global heroin supply. Eradicating such a vast and entrenched industry requires immense resources, and the task becomes even more difficult in a country where rural populations rely heavily on opium poppy cultivation for their livelihoods. Despite eradication programs, the deep-seated economic dependence on the drug trade has made it difficult to persuade farmers to abandon opium cultivation without viable alternatives. Another significant obstacle has been the political instability and corruption within Afghanistan. Local warlords, insurgents, and even government officials often have financial ties to the drug trade, which complicates the enforcement of anti-narcotics policies. In some cases, military and police personnel who are meant to fight drug trafficking are themselves involved in the illicit trade. This corruption undermines efforts by NATO and the UN to create effective law enforcement mechanisms and build institutional capacity. NATO's military operations, while targeting drug labs and trafficking networks, have faced fierce resistance from insurgents who profit from the trade. Insurgent groups, especially the Taliban, have used opium as a significant source of revenue to fund their operations against Afghan and coalition forces. The Taliban's control over key poppy-producing regions has made it nearly impossible for NATO forces to eliminate opium production without facing violent retaliation. The difficult terrain of Afghanistan, with its vast mountainous regions and porous borders, further complicates military and law enforcement operations. Additionally, international forces have been criticized for focusing on eradication without providing enough support for alternative livelihoods. Programs aimed at promoting legal agriculture and economic development have been underfunded and insufficient to counterbalance the financial incentives offered by opium cultivation. Ultimately, the UN and NATO's counter-narcotics efforts have been hampered by a combination of corruption, political instability, entrenched poverty, and the resilience of insurgent groups. While both organizations have made strides in certain areas, the complexity of the drug trade in Afghanistan requires a more comprehensive and long-term approach, one that combines military action, governance reform, economic development, and regional cooperation. Chapter 5: Corruption and the Afghan Government. Corruption within the Afghan government has been a significant barrier to effective governance and the successful fight against the opium trade. Despite substantial international aid and efforts by both the US and NATO to stabilize the country, corruption at various levels of government has undermined progress, facilitating the continued expansion of the illicit drug economy. One of the most troubling aspects of corruption in Afghanistan is its deep entanglement with the drug trade. Afghan officials, from local police officers to high-ranking government figures, have been reported to be directly involved in or complicit with drug trafficking operations. In some cases, corrupt officials have provided protection to drug traffickers, facilitated the transport of heroin, and even profited from opium cultivation by taxing it. This widespread corruption has made it difficult for international forces and Afghan authorities to dismantle the opium supply chain effectively, as key players within the government are incentivized to maintain the status quo. The role of local power brokers, warlords, and tribal leaders further complicates the situation. These figures often hold significant influence over regional politics and are deeply tied to the opium trade. Many of them, having gained wealth and power through drug-related activities, resist any efforts to curtail opium cultivation. Their ability to manipulate political processes and co-opt government resources has made anti-narcotics initiatives difficult to enforce, especially in rural areas where poppy farming is prevalent. Corruption within the Afghan police and military has also had a detrimental effect on counter-narcotics efforts. Afghan security forces, who are tasked with enforcing the law and combating the drug trade, have often been accused of turning a blind eye to opium cultivation or even engaging in trafficking themselves. This lack of accountability has resulted in low levels of trust between the Afghan population and their government, as well as among international partners who struggle to work with a government riddled with corruption. The international community, particularly the US, has invested heavily in building the capacity of the Afghan government to fight corruption and strengthen the rule of law. However, these efforts have met with limited success. The Afghan government's failure to address systemic corruption and its inability to implement effective anti-corruption measures have created a vicious cycle where drug money fuels corruption, and corruption in turn allows the drug trade to flourish. In conclusion, corruption within the Afghan government has been one of the key factors sustaining the opium trade in the country. Until the government can address these deep-rooted issues, including the reform of its security forces and judicial systems, the battle against the drug trade will remain largely ineffective. Government involvement in the opium trade. The Afghan government's involvement in the opium trade has been a deeply contentious issue, contributing to the persistence of the drug economy in the country. While it is often difficult to pinpoint the exact extent of official involvement, numerous reports and investigations have shown that corruption and complicity at various levels of government have allowed the opium trade to flourish, despite international efforts to curtail it. At the highest levels of government, there have been allegations that senior officials, including members of the cabinet and the police force, have had direct ties to the drug trade. These officials are often involved in protecting drug traffickers, facilitating the transportation of heroin, or even profiting from the trade themselves. The large sums of money generated by opium trafficking have been a powerful motivator for corruption, leading to a situation where law enforcement and political figures often turned a blind eye to illegal activities, or worse, actively participated in them. In addition to corruption at the top, local and regional governments, including provincial governors and police chiefs, have frequently been implicated in enabling the opium trade. These local officials are often in a position to directly influence the cultivation of opium poppies, either by offering protection to farmers or by directly benefiting from the revenues generated by the drug trade. In some cases, local officials have been known to extract taxes from opium farmers or allow them to cultivate poppies in exchange for kickbacks. This creates a system in which the government becomes complicit in the perpetuation of the opium economy, despite public rhetoric condemning the trade. Furthermore, the lack of effective governance and the weakness of the Afghan state in many rural areas have allowed the drug trade to thrive. In areas controlled by the Taliban or other insurgent groups, the government often has little to no presence, which allows the drug trade to operate without interference. Even in regions under government control, weak infrastructure, a lack of resources, and ongoing security challenges have made it difficult to enforce anti-narcotics laws. The Afghan government's inability or unwillingness to tackle these issues head-on has had significant consequences for the country's efforts to combat the opium trade. While international forces have made attempts to curb opium production through eradication programs and law enforcement efforts, the government's own involvement in the trade has undermined these efforts, creating a vicious cycle that perpetuates the drug economy. Ultimately, the Afghan government's involvement in the opium trade is a key factor that has hindered meaningful progress in combating the drug trade. Until the government addresses the systemic corruption and takes concrete steps to reform law enforcement and governance at all levels, it will be difficult to break the grip of the opium trade on the country. Corruption at the local and national levels. Corruption has been a pervasive and persistent issue within Afghanistan's political and security structures, manifesting at both the local and national levels. This widespread corruption has played a critical role in enabling the opium trade to flourish, as drug traffickers, insurgent groups, and even government officials have all been implicated in the illicit economy. The intertwining of corruption with the opium trade has severely undermined the country's governance, law enforcement, and efforts to combat narcotics. At the national level, high-ranking officials have been accused of profiting from the opium trade or turning a blind eye to it in exchange for financial gain. The Afghan government has struggled with systemic corruption, which has eroded public trust in its ability to provide security and governance. For example, some ministers and members of parliament have been implicated in drug trafficking networks, either by directly benefiting from the trade or by offering protection to drug lords and smugglers. This complicity at the top levels of government has made it difficult to implement meaningful anti-narcotics policies and to combat the influence of the drug trade on the country's political landscape. Corruption at the local level is equally damaging and is often seen in the form of local law enforcement officials, police officers, and provincial governors engaging in or turning a blind eye to the opium trade. In rural areas where opium poppy cultivation is prevalent, local police officers and officials are frequently accused of accepting bribes from drug traffickers or providing them with protection in exchange for a share of the profits. This has created a corrupt system where the drug trade is not only tolerated, but facilitated by those tasked with enforcing the law. Local farmers, often dependent on the income from opium cultivation, have been known to pay off authorities to ensure that their crops are left undisturbed. The link between corruption and the opium trade has also been exacerbated by Afghanistan's weak legal and judicial systems. Even when drug traffickers or corrupt officials are arrested, the courts often lack the resources or the will to prosecute them effectively. In many cases, powerful drug cartels or insurgent groups exert influence over judicial proceedings, ensuring that their operations continue without significant interference. This further undermines the rule of law and creates a climate of impunity in which corruption thrives. The combination of corruption at both the local and national levels has created a cycle of lawlessness and instability, which is difficult to break. Until there are effective reforms to address corruption in the Afghan government and security forces, the fight against the opium trade will continue to face significant setbacks. The impact of the opium trade on Afghan governance. The opium trade has had a profound and destabilizing impact on Afghan governance, contributing to widespread corruption, undermining the rule of law, and exacerbating political instability. The illicit drug economy has not only enriched insurgent groups like the Taliban, but has also created a deep-rooted cycle of dependency that has hindered the ability of the Afghan government to maintain control and provide basic services to its citizens. The political and economic influence of the opium trade has been a significant obstacle to the establishment of a strong, functioning government in Afghanistan. One of the primary ways the opium trade has affected Afghan governance is through corruption. As opium became a major source of income, both for insurgents and government officials, the flow of illicit drug money infiltrated all levels of government, from local law enforcement to high-ranking officials in Kabul. This corruption has led to a situation where law enforcement, the judiciary, and political figures are either directly involved in or turn a blind eye to the drug trade. Local police and military forces, underpaid and often undertrained, have been known to take bribes from drug traffickers or even facilitate the transport of heroin. This not only undermines efforts to combat the drug trade, but also erodes public trust in government institutions, which are perceived as corrupt and ineffective. Furthermore, the opium trade has created an environment of instability that has allowed insurgent groups like the Taliban to thrive. The revenue generated from the drug trade has funded their operations and enabled them to continue challenging the Afghan government's authority. As a result, the government has struggled to assert control over rural areas, where opium cultivation is most prevalent. The Taliban's control of key opium-producing regions has made it difficult for the government to implement anti-narcotics policies or extend its influence beyond urban centers. This has contributed to the fragmentation of the country, with large swaths of the population living under the control of insurgent groups rather than the Afghan government. In addition to corruption and insurgency, the opium trade has also exacerbated Afghanistan's economic struggles. While opium has provided a significant source of income for farmers in rural areas, it has prevented the development of a more diversified economy. The government's inability to provide viable alternatives to opium cultivation, such as access to education, infrastructure, and legitimate markets, has kept many rural communities dependent on illicit drug production. This economic dependency has further undermined the legitimacy of the government, as it has failed to offer a path out of poverty that does not rely on the opium trade. In conclusion, the opium trade has had a devastating impact on Afghan governance. By fostering corruption, financing insurgency, and inhibiting economic development, it has made it difficult for the Afghan government to establish the stability and rule of law necessary for long-term peace and prosperity. Addressing the opium trade is therefore a critical component of any comprehensive strategy to strengthen governance and rebuild Afghanistan's institutions. Chapter 6: The Socioeconomic Consequences of the Opium Trade. The opium trade in Afghanistan has had significant and far-reaching socioeconomic consequences for the country, affecting not only its economy but also the social fabric of Afghan society. While opium cultivation has provided a source of income for many rural families, its pervasive presence has also contributed to widespread poverty, social instability, and the erosion of legitimate economic opportunities. The consequences of this illicit trade are felt across all sectors, from education and healthcare to governance and public security. Economically, Afghanistan's heavy reliance on the opium trade has hindered the development of other industries and sectors that could have contributed to long-term growth. While opium cultivation is highly profitable, it has created a mono-economy where millions of farmers are dependent on the illicit crop for their survival. This dependency on a single, unstable source of income has left many rural communities vulnerable to fluctuations in opium prices and government eradication efforts. As a result, many farmers face economic hardship when prices drop or when government or international forces destroy their crops. Without viable alternatives, these farmers are often forced to return to opium cultivation, perpetuating the cycle of dependency and poverty. The widespread availability of opium has also had significant social impacts. The wealth generated by the drug trade has fueled corruption, organized crime, and violence throughout the country. Communities that are involved in the drug trade often face heightened levels of social instability, as conflicts arise between local populations, drug traffickers, and law enforcement. In many areas, the lack of a strong state presence has led to the rise of local militias or warlords who control opium production and distribution. These armed groups often use intimidation and violence to maintain their control, further exacerbating insecurity and instability in rural regions. The opium trade has also contributed to Afghanistan's public health crisis. The country's role as a major producer of heroin has created a significant addiction problem, not only within Afghanistan, but also in neighboring countries. As opium is processed into heroin, its impact extends beyond the borders of Afghanistan, contributing to the global drug trade. Within Afghanistan, addiction rates have risen, particularly in urban centers, where heroin consumption has become widespread. This addiction problem has strained the already fragile healthcare system, as resources that could have been used to address other health concerns are diverted to combating the effects of drug addiction. Additionally, the opium trade has had a detrimental effect on education. Children in opium-producing regions often face limited access to schooling, as families are preoccupied with the cultivation and trade of opium. In some areas, drug money has been used to fund armed groups rather than to invest in schools or educational infrastructure. This has created a generation of young people who are disconnected from education and economic opportunities, further perpetuating the cycle of poverty and instability. In conclusion, the socioeconomic consequences of the opium trade in Afghanistan are profound and multifaceted. While it has provided short-term financial relief for some, it has ultimately hindered the country's long-term development, deepened social divisions, and fueled corruption, violence, and addiction. Breaking the cycle of dependency on opium will require comprehensive reforms, including economic diversification, infrastructure development, and strong governance, to provide sustainable alternatives for Afghanistan's rural population. The effects on rural communities and farmers. The opium trade has had a profound impact on rural communities and farmers in Afghanistan, both economically and socially. While opium cultivation has provided a source of income for many families, it has also entrenched poverty, created dependency, and fueled a cycle of exploitation and instability that continues to affect the livelihoods of millions of rural Afghans. For these communities, the allure of the lucrative opium market often outweighs the risks, but the consequences are far-reaching and complex. For many Afghan farmers, growing opium poppies is not a choice but a necessity. In regions where agricultural infrastructure is underdeveloped and access to markets for legal crops is limited, opium poppies offer a higher yield and a more immediate source of income. The growing demand for heroin globally has made opium cultivation a highly profitable enterprise. As a result, many rural farmers have turned to opium poppies as their primary source of livelihood, especially when they face the prospect of poverty or hunger from growing less profitable crops like wheat or vegetables. However, the economic benefits of opium cultivation are short-term and fragile. Farmers are often caught in a cycle of dependency on the drug trade. When government forces or international agencies conduct poppy eradication campaigns, farmers face the loss of their primary income source without viable alternatives. With little access to financial services or government support, many farmers are forced to return to opium cultivation to survive. Furthermore, the volatility of the opium market, subject to shifts in demand, government policy, or military intervention, means that even those who profit from the drug trade may face sudden financial ruin. The social consequences of the opium trade are equally severe. As opium production becomes more entrenched in rural communities, it often leads to the erosion of traditional farming practices and social structures. Communities that once relied on agriculture for their sustenance are now dependent on the illicit drug economy, which undermines local governance and weakens community bonds. In some cases, local warlords or insurgent groups gain control of opium-producing areas, further destabilizing rural regions. These groups exert power over farmers, sometimes forcing them to grow opium poppies or taxing them heavily. The resulting exploitation and coercion make it difficult for farmers to escape the grip of the opium trade. Additionally, the rise in opium production has had a negative impact on family structures. As many farmers and local leaders become involved in or profit from the drug trade, it becomes more difficult to maintain moral and legal boundaries. In some cases, entire communities become complicit in the trade, with devastating effects on social cohesion and community trust. Moreover, the influx of drug money has fueled corruption and lawlessness, making it harder for local authorities to provide security or enforce the rule of law. In conclusion, while opium cultivation has provided a means of survival for rural Afghan farmers, it has also created long-term challenges. The dependence on the opium trade has fostered economic vulnerability, social instability, and a breakdown of traditional community structures. For lasting change, Afghanistan needs comprehensive solutions that include alternative livelihoods, agricultural reform, and strong local governance to offer rural communities a path away from illicit drug production. Opium addiction and public health crisis. Opium addiction has emerged as a severe public health crisis in Afghanistan, exacerbating the country's already fragile health system and contributing to widespread social issues. As one of the largest producers of opium in the world, Afghanistan has seen a dramatic rise in heroin addiction, affecting urban centers and rural communities alike. The consequences of this addiction crisis are devastating, impacting not only those who are directly affected by addiction, but also the broader society, as it fuels crime, corruption, and social instability. Heroin addiction has become a significant problem in Afghanistan, largely due to the widespread availability of opium and the lack of effective treatment options. With Afghanistan's central role in the global drug trade, millions of Afghan citizens, especially in urban areas, have become victims of addiction. As opium is processed into heroin, it finds its way into Afghan cities, where demand for the drug is high. The problem has escalated over the years, with addiction rates rising sharply since the 1990s. This has placed enormous strain on the country's healthcare system, which is ill-equipped to deal with the scale of addiction-related health issues. The lack of access to addiction treatment and rehabilitation services is a significant barrier to addressing the crisis. Afghanistan's healthcare system is underfunded and overwhelmed, particularly in rural areas where the majority of opium production takes place. Few addiction recovery programs exist, and those that do are often under-resourced and unable to cope with the demand. As a result, many addicts do not receive the care they need, leading to a cycle of addiction that continues to devastate families and communities. In addition to the physical and psychological toll of addiction, the social consequences are also severe. Opium addiction has contributed to an increase in crime, as addicts resort to theft and violence to fund their habits. It has also played a role in the breakdown of families, with addiction leading to social isolation, domestic violence, and poverty. As addiction spreads, it weakens the social fabric, making it harder for communities to function and for individuals to escape the cycle of poverty and drug dependency. Furthermore, the public health crisis associated with opium addiction has global implications. Afghanistan's role in the heroin trade has contributed to the spread of addiction in neighboring countries, such as Pakistan and Iran, and even further afield. The illicit drug trade and addiction problems in Afghanistan have become a regional and international security concern, as the trade fuels organized crime, terrorism, and instability. In conclusion, opium addiction has become a critical public health crisis in Afghanistan. The lack of effective treatment, combined with the widespread availability of opium, has created a situation where addiction has deeply affected both individuals and society as a whole. Addressing the public health consequences of addiction requires comprehensive solutions, including improved healthcare infrastructure, addiction treatment programs, and international support to reduce the opium trade and its devastating effects. Economic dependency on the opium industry. The opium industry has become a cornerstone of Afghanistan's economy, with millions of people across the country relying on it for their livelihoods. From farmers in rural areas to drug traffickers and insurgent groups, the opium trade has entrenched itself as a critical source of income, perpetuating an economic system that is heavily dependent on the illegal drug market. While opium cultivation offers short-term financial gains, it has created a cycle of dependency that hinders long-term economic growth and development in the country. For many Afghan farmers, opium poppies are the most profitable crop available. In areas where traditional farming is not financially viable due to a lack of infrastructure, irrigation, or access to markets, opium offers a lucrative alternative. The high returns from opium cultivation, compared to other agricultural products like wheat or vegetables, have led many farmers to dedicate large portions of their land to poppy farming. However, this dependence on a single cash crop has left these rural communities vulnerable to fluctuations in the global opium market and to government efforts to eradicate poppy fields. When prices fall or eradication campaigns disrupt cultivation, farmers face economic hardship, yet are often forced to return to opium production due to the absence of viable alternatives. The economic dependency on opium extends beyond farming and into the broader Afghan economy. The trade in opium provides significant funding to insurgent groups, including the Taliban, who use the revenue to finance their operations. These armed groups often exert control over poppy-growing regions, taxing farmers and trafficking networks. The reliance on drug money has therefore sustained insurgent activity and contributed to ongoing instability, further weakening the Afghan government's control over key areas of the country. Additionally, the reliance on the opium industry has stunted efforts to diversify the Afghan economy. While other sectors, such as mining and agriculture, hold potential for long-term growth, the dominance of the illicit drug trade has diverted attention and resources from legal economic development. Foreign aid and investments have often been channeled into counter-narcotics efforts, rather than into building infrastructure or creating sustainable economic alternatives. This lack of economic diversification has kept Afghanistan in a state of dependency on the opium trade, preventing the development of a more resilient and diversified economy. In conclusion, Afghanistan's economic dependency on the opium industry has had far-reaching consequences for the country's development. While it provides immediate financial relief for many, it perpetuates a cycle of vulnerability, corruption, and instability. For sustainable progress, Afghanistan must find ways to reduce its reliance on the opium trade by promoting alternative livelihoods, improving infrastructure, and fostering economic diversification. Chapter 7: The Role of Foreign Powers in the Opium Trade. Foreign powers have played a significant and complex role in the opium trade in Afghanistan, both directly and indirectly influencing its proliferation. While international efforts to curb the opium trade have been ongoing, the involvement of foreign governments, intelligence agencies, and military forces has shaped the trajectory of the drug trade in ways that are not always straightforward. These foreign powers, through military intervention, financial aid, and geopolitical interests, have had a profound impact on the Afghan opium industry. One of the most significant foreign influences has come from the United States and its allies, particularly during the post-9/11 era. The U.S.-led coalition, which sought to dismantle the Taliban regime and combat terrorism, also made efforts to eradicate opium cultivation in Afghanistan. However, these efforts have been met with mixed results. While the U.S. and NATO forces targeted drug trafficking networks and attempted to destroy poppy fields, the very presence of foreign military forces in the country inadvertently fueled the opium trade. In many cases, local farmers and insurgents found ways to exploit the U.S. presence, using drug revenue to fund operations and reinforce their resistance against foreign forces. The challenge of simultaneously fighting insurgency while addressing the opium trade created a paradox, where efforts to curb the drug trade often conflicted with military objectives. The role of foreign intelligence agencies has also been integral to the dynamics of the opium trade. Some reports suggest that intelligence agencies from various countries, including the U.S. and regional powers, have been involved in indirectly facilitating the drug trade for strategic purposes. Afghanistan's opium has often been trafficked through neighboring countries, including Pakistan, Iran, and Central Asia, and foreign intelligence agencies have sometimes turned a blind eye to these activities in pursuit of their broader geopolitical objectives. These agencies may have deemed the opium trade as a lesser priority in comparison to broader regional concerns, such as counterterrorism or counterinsurgency. Additionally, countries like Russia and Iran, which are heavily impacted by the flow of heroin from Afghanistan, have been involved in counter-narcotics efforts, often working in collaboration with the Afghan government and the U.S.-led coalition. However, their efforts have sometimes been undermined by corruption, lack of resources, and the continuing volatility of the region. Iran, for instance, has faced the dual challenge of combating drug trafficking along its porous border with Afghanistan, while dealing with its own domestic drug addiction crisis. In conclusion, the role of foreign powers in the Afghan opium trade has been a tangled web of military, intelligence, and political interests. While the international community has made efforts to combat the trade, these actions have often been complicated by the broader geopolitical realities of the region. The opium trade in Afghanistan remains deeply intertwined with foreign involvement, and addressing it effectively requires cooperation, coordinated efforts, and a long-term strategy that considers the region's complex dynamics. The U.S. and its war on drugs in Afghanistan. The U.S. war on drugs in Afghanistan has been a central component of the broader U.S. military and geopolitical strategy in the region since the invasion in 2001. As one of the world's largest producers of opium, Afghanistan has long been at the heart of global drug trafficking networks, and U.S. efforts to curb the production and trade of opium have been a key focus of both military and counter-narcotics operations. However, the success of these efforts has been mixed, and the fight against the drug trade has been fraught with challenges. The U.S. government's involvement in Afghanistan's drug trade issue began in earnest after the Taliban's ousting. The U.S. initially implemented eradication programs to destroy poppy fields and reduce heroin production, in cooperation with the Afghan government. These programs included aerial spraying, ground-based eradication teams, and providing alternative crops for farmers. The idea was that by removing the economic incentive for opium cultivation, the country could be weaned off its reliance on the drug trade and encouraged to focus on other legitimate forms of agriculture. However, the strategy faced significant hurdles. Poppy farmers, who were often living in poverty, found it difficult to switch to other crops that were not as immediately profitable. The lack of infrastructure, poor agricultural practices, and ongoing insecurity further complicated the transition. Moreover, U.S. military operations inadvertently fueled the drug trade. In many cases, the Taliban, who had once cracked down on opium production, turned to opium as a source of revenue to fund their insurgency. As U.S. forces fought the Taliban, they were often unable to fully control the rural areas where opium was grown, leading to a situation where opium production continued unchecked in many regions. In some cases, insurgent groups taxed the opium trade, using the proceeds to finance their operations against U.S. and NATO forces. This created a vicious cycle where the U.S. military's presence in the country both destabilized the region and created further opportunities for drug trafficking. The U.S. also faced the issue of corruption within the Afghan government, which weakened efforts to combat the drug trade. Many local officials and law enforcement officers were directly involved in the opium trade, either through bribery or active participation. As a result, the efforts to eradicate opium cultivation were often undermined by those in power who had a vested interest in the status quo. In conclusion, the U.S. war on drugs in Afghanistan has been a complex and difficult campaign. While significant resources have been allocated to combat the opium trade, the ongoing conflict, corruption, and economic dependency on opium have made it difficult to achieve lasting success. The war on drugs in Afghanistan highlights the challenges of addressing illicit trade in a conflict-ridden environment where military, economic, and social factors are intricately interwoven. The influence of neighboring countries on the trade. The opium trade in Afghanistan is not an isolated issue. It is deeply influenced by the actions and policies of neighboring countries. Afghanistan shares borders with several nations, each of which plays a significant role in the production, trafficking, and consumption of opium. These neighboring countries, including Pakistan, Iran, Tajikistan, and China, have varying levels of involvement in the Afghan drug trade, either as transit routes, end consumers, or sources of demand for heroin. Their influence has both facilitated and hindered efforts to curb the opium trade in Afghanistan. Pakistan, to the south of Afghanistan, is one of the most critical players in the opium trade. As a major transit country, Pakistan serves as a crucial route for heroin to reach global markets. The porous border between Afghanistan and Pakistan allows traffickers to move drugs with relative ease, avoiding customs checks and law enforcement efforts. In some cases, elements within Pakistan's security forces and political system have been accused of turning a blind eye to the trade, either due to corruption or the desire to maintain stability in Afghanistan. The Taliban, who control significant portions of Afghan territory, are also believed to have ties with drug lords in Pakistan, making the region a hub for both opium production and trafficking. Iran, which shares a border with Afghanistan to the west, is another key player. As a country that is both a consumer of opium and a transit point for heroin destined for Europe and the Middle East, Iran has been severely affected by the drug trade. The Iranian government has taken significant steps to curb trafficking, such as increasing border security and conducting anti-drug operations. However, despite these efforts, Iran remains one of the largest consumers of opium in the world, and the country's long and porous border with Afghanistan makes it difficult to fully control the flow of drugs. Tajikistan, to the north of Afghanistan, is another important transit country for Afghan opium. The landlocked nature of Afghanistan means that traffickers often use Central Asia, including Tajikistan, as a route to smuggle heroin into Russia and other parts of Europe. The political and economic instability in Tajikistan has made it difficult for the government to effectively address the opium trade, and drug smuggling has flourished in the region. China, while not a direct neighbor, also influences the Afghan opium trade through its demand for heroin. As one of the world's largest consumers of illicit drugs, particularly heroin, China serves as both a destination and a transit country for heroin produced in Afghanistan. The Chinese government has made efforts to reduce domestic drug consumption and combat trafficking, but the demand for heroin continues to fuel the opium trade in Afghanistan. In conclusion, the influence of neighboring countries on Afghanistan's opium trade is complex and multifaceted. While some countries actively combat drug trafficking, others either passively allow it or are directly involved in the trade. Efforts to tackle the opium problem in Afghanistan must therefore involve regional cooperation and coordination, as the drug trade does not respect borders. How the opium trade benefited global drug markets. The opium trade has played a pivotal role in supplying global drug markets, with Afghanistan serving as the largest producer of opium and heroin in the world. The sheer scale of opium cultivation and its transformation into heroin has not only shaped the Afghan economy, but also significantly impacted global drug consumption patterns, fueling addiction and contributing to the rise of organized crime around the world. At the heart of the global drug trade, Afghan opium has met the insatiable demand for heroin, particularly in Europe, Russia, and the United States. The high purity and low cost of Afghan heroin made it particularly appealing to drug cartels and traffickers. Afghanistan's strategic location, bordering countries with weak or porous borders, facilitated the smuggling of heroin into international markets. As a result, Afghan opium helped to maintain a steady supply for the global heroin market, often saturating countries that were already grappling with high rates of drug addiction. For the global drug cartels, Afghan opium became a critical raw material in the production of heroin. The massive scale of production in Afghanistan ensured that there was a continuous, inexpensive supply of opium, allowing drug syndicates to control prices and expand their networks. The heroin produced from Afghan opium was not only high quality, but also widely distributed across various regions. The trade routes used to smuggle heroin through Central Asia, the Middle East, and Europe were often controlled by powerful criminal organizations, which reaped enormous profits. These profits were used to finance other illicit activities, including arms trafficking, human trafficking, and terrorism, which further fueled the global security crisis. The economic impact of Afghan opium on global drug markets extended beyond the cartels. For many countries in the West, particularly in the US and European nations, Afghan heroin has been one of the main sources of supply for domestic drug markets. The rising demand for heroin in these countries was met by the steady influx of heroin produced from Afghan opium. Despite efforts to curb drug consumption, heroin addiction rates continued to rise, contributing to a public health crisis. The connection between Afghan opium and global drug markets has thus had a profound social and economic cost, driving addiction rates and burdening healthcare systems. In conclusion, the opium trade from Afghanistan has significantly benefited global drug markets by supplying a constant flow of high-quality heroin. This trade has not only fueled addiction and organized crime, but has also perpetuated a vicious cycle of violence and instability, both within Afghanistan and across the globe. The extensive networks that rely on Afghan opium have ensured its place at the core of the global drug trade, making it a key driver of illicit drug consumption and trafficking. Chapter 8: Counter-Opium Strategies and Their Failures. Counter-opium strategies in Afghanistan have been numerous, yet they have largely failed to curtail the country's role as the world's leading producer of opium. Despite billions of dollars in international aid, extensive military and law enforcement operations, and a variety of eradication and alternative development programs, the opium trade continues to thrive in the country. Several factors have contributed to the failure of these strategies, including a lack of coordination, corruption, insufficient resources, and the complex socio-political dynamics of Afghanistan. One of the primary approaches to countering opium production has been eradication. The United States, in particular, funded and supported efforts to destroy opium poppy fields through both manual and aerial spraying. However, eradication programs faced significant resistance from local farmers who were economically dependent on opium production. The high profitability of opium cultivation, combined with limited alternative livelihoods, made it difficult for farmers to abandon poppy farming. Furthermore, such programs often alienated rural communities, who saw the eradication efforts as a form of foreign interference and oppression, thereby fueling resentment and undermining cooperation. The alternative development strategy, which aimed to replace opium cultivation with legal crops, also failed to produce lasting results. While projects to promote crops like wheat, fruit, and vegetables were implemented, they were hampered by several challenges. Afghanistan's agricultural sector suffered from poor infrastructure, lack of irrigation systems, and inadequate access to markets, making it difficult for farmers to find viable alternatives to opium. Moreover, the ongoing insecurity and the presence of insurgent groups, such as the Taliban, who taxed farmers or controlled opium production areas, disrupted the success of these programs. In addition to these issues, corruption at both local and national levels further undermined counter-narcotics efforts. Many government officials, law enforcement agents, and even military personnel were reportedly involved in or turned a blind eye to the opium trade, either due to bribery or because they had financial stakes in the industry. This widespread corruption meant that many efforts to curb the trade were either ineffectively enforced or intentionally ignored, allowing the opium industry to continue. In conclusion, counter-opium strategies in Afghanistan have largely failed due to the complex interplay of economic, social, and political factors. While foreign governments and international organizations have spent significant resources on eradication and alternative development, these efforts have often been met with resistance, inefficiency, and corruption. Without addressing the underlying issues of poverty, insecurity, and governance, the opium trade is likely to remain a persistent challenge for Afghanistan. Alternative livelihood programs for Afghan farmers. Alternative livelihood programs have been a key component of international efforts to reduce opium cultivation in Afghanistan. These programs aim to provide farmers with viable alternatives to growing poppy, which is a highly profitable crop in a country where many rural communities face extreme poverty. However, despite significant investments and numerous initiatives, the success of these programs has been mixed, as they often fail to address the complex economic, social, and political realities that make opium cultivation an attractive option for Afghan farmers. The primary goal of alternative livelihood programs is to replace poppy cultivation with legal crops such as wheat, vegetables, and fruit, which can provide income without contributing to the global drug trade. International agencies, including the United States and the United Nations, have funded various agricultural projects to help farmers transition from opium to other crops. These initiatives often involve providing seeds, fertilizers, irrigation systems, and training in modern farming techniques. The idea is that by increasing agricultural productivity and offering better market access, farmers will be more likely to abandon opium cultivation in favor of legal alternatives. However, the reality on the ground has proven far more complicated. Afghanistan's agricultural sector is plagued by numerous challenges, including poor infrastructure, unreliable water sources, and a lack of access to markets for legal crops. Many farmers live in remote areas with limited transportation options, making it difficult for them to sell their produce. Additionally, the country's long-standing insecurity, exacerbated by the presence of insurgent groups like the Taliban, has made it difficult for farmers to cultivate legal crops safely or profitably. In many cases, insurgents have taxed or threatened farmers, further pushing them toward cultivating opium, which remains more lucrative than traditional crops. Another significant challenge to the success of alternative livelihoods is the lack of consistent support from the Afghan government. While the government has implemented programs to promote alternative crops, corruption, inefficiency, and limited resources have often hampered their effectiveness. In some cases, farmers who have made the switch to legal crops have received little follow-up support, leaving them vulnerable to the same economic pressures that drove them to cultivate poppy in the first place. In conclusion, while alternative livelihood programs have been a central part of efforts to combat Afghanistan's opium trade, their impact has been limited. To be successful, these programs must not only offer viable agricultural alternatives, but also address the broader issues of insecurity, market access and governance that make opium cultivation so attractive to Afghan farmers. Without comprehensive support and a long-term commitment to rural development, it is unlikely that alternative livelihood programs will fully replace opium cultivation in Afghanistan. The failure of eradication efforts. Eradication efforts aimed at reducing opium cultivation in Afghanistan have been a central part of the international community's strategy to combat the country's role in the global drug trade. However, despite years of investment, these efforts have largely failed to achieve their objectives. Several factors, including local resistance, inadequate support for alternative livelihoods, and the complex socio-political environment, have contributed to the failure of eradication programs. One of the primary methods used in eradication efforts has been the aerial spraying of herbicides to destroy poppy crops. The United States and other international partners provided funding for large-scale aerial spraying campaigns, with the hope that destroying the poppy fields would reduce opium production. However, this approach proved to be highly controversial. Many Afghan farmers, who rely on opium as their main source of income, saw the spraying as an attack on their livelihoods. As a result, these programs often led to local resistance and resentment towards the government and foreign forces. In many cases, farmers who lost their crops due to spraying simply replanted poppy seeds, as opium remained a far more lucrative option than alternative crops. Additionally, aerial spraying has been criticized for its environmental impact, as herbicides often damaged other crops and natural resources, leading to food insecurity for local populations. This further exacerbated the economic pressures on farmers, who had few other options to sustain their families. The lack of follow-up support or alternative livelihood options left many farmers with no choice but to return to poppy cultivation. Ground-based eradication efforts, which involved the destruction of poppy fields by local law enforcement or military personnel, also faced significant challenges. These efforts were often undermined by corruption within the Afghan government and local security forces, who were either complicit in the opium trade or were bribed by drug traffickers. This corruption rendered eradication efforts ineffective, as officials often turned a blind eye or actively facilitated the continued cultivation of poppies. Furthermore, the Taliban and other insurgent groups capitalized on the instability caused by eradication efforts. In many areas, these groups not only allowed, but actively encouraged opium cultivation as a means of generating revenue for their operations. The Taliban, in particular, levied taxes on opium production, further entrenching the trade. In conclusion, the failure of eradication efforts in Afghanistan can be attributed to a combination of factors, including local resistance, environmental damage, corruption, and the lack of viable alternatives for farmers. While eradication has been a key component of anti-drug policies, it is clear that without addressing the root causes of opium cultivation, such as poverty, insecurity, and weak governance, these efforts are unlikely to succeed in the long term. The effectiveness of international drug control policies. International drug control policies, particularly those aimed at curbing the opium trade in Afghanistan, have faced significant challenges and limited success. These policies, led by international bodies such as the United Nations and supported by various countries, have included a range of approaches, from military intervention to development assistance. However, the persistent failure to reduce opium production in Afghanistan highlights the shortcomings of these strategies in addressing the root causes of the drug trade. One of the most well-known international efforts in drug control has been the War on Drugs, which has included initiatives like eradication programs and counter-narcotics operations. While these efforts have been well-funded and have garnered significant attention, they have had limited impact on reducing global drug flows. In Afghanistan, for example, despite extensive eradication programs, opium production remains a central component of the rural economy. This can be attributed to the limited effectiveness of enforcement-based strategies in a country where the rule of law is weak and local governance structures are often corrupt or ineffective. International drug control policies also heavily rely on law enforcement efforts to intercept drug shipments, dismantle trafficking networks, and punish offenders. These initiatives have seen some success, particularly in disrupting large-scale trafficking operations. However, such actions often fail to address the underlying socioeconomic conditions that make drug trafficking an attractive enterprise. The lack of alternative livelihoods for farmers, persistent poverty, and the continuing conflict in Afghanistan mean that drug production remains a viable option for many. Furthermore, international drug control policies often struggle with coordination and consistency. Different countries have different priorities, which sometimes leads to fragmented or contradictory approaches. While some countries focus on supply-side efforts, others emphasize demand reduction, and there is little consensus on the most effective strategy. In addition, the political dynamics of Afghanistan, including the role of insurgent groups like the Taliban, complicate the enforcement of drug control policies, as these groups are often directly involved in or benefit from the trade. In conclusion, while international drug control policies have had some successes in targeting specific aspects of the drug trade, their overall effectiveness has been limited. The failure to address the root causes of opium cultivation, such as poverty, lack of governance, and ongoing conflict, has hindered the success of these efforts. For drug control policies to be truly effective, they must go beyond enforcement and focus on long-term solutions that address the social, economic, and political factors driving the opium trade. Conclusion. The opium trade has had a profound impact on Afghanistan, influencing its economy, politics, and security, while also shaping global drug markets. From its origins as a traditional crop to its rise as a key component of the global drug trade, Afghanistan's opium production has fueled conflict, terrorism, and corruption, while providing a livelihood for many of the country's impoverished farmers. Despite numerous international efforts to curb the trade, including eradication programs, alternative livelihood initiatives, and military interventions, the opium industry has continued to thrive, underscoring the complex and entrenched nature of the issue. The involvement of powerful actors, such as the Taliban, local warlords, and international drug cartels, has further complicated efforts to dismantle the opium trade. The drug trade has provided significant financial resources to militant groups, allowing them to fund their operations and challenge both the Afghan government and foreign forces. Corruption within the Afghan government and security forces has also played a critical role in perpetuating the drug trade, as officials have often turned a blind eye to the industry or directly benefited from it. International drug control policies, while well-intentioned, have largely failed to address the root causes of opium production. Strategies focused on eradication and law enforcement have often been met with resistance from local communities who rely on opium as a primary source of income. The lack of viable alternatives for farmers and the ongoing insecurity in the country have made it difficult for these policies to achieve long-term success. Furthermore, the fragmented and inconsistent approach of international actors has hindered the coordination needed for an effective response. Ultimately, the failure to stem the opium trade in Afghanistan highlights the need for a more comprehensive approach that goes beyond military and law enforcement efforts. To achieve meaningful progress, strategies must address the underlying socioeconomic, political, and security challenges that drive the opium trade. This requires a focus on poverty reduction, good governance, and the provision of alternative livelihoods, as well as greater international cooperation and support for Afghanistan's long-term development. Only by tackling these root causes can Afghanistan hope to break free from the grip of the opium trade and build a more stable and prosperous future.
Chapter 1: Prelude to War. In the years leading up to the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, the groundwork for one of the longest military engagements in American history was quietly being laid. While the world largely focused on the aftermath of the Cold War and rising globalization, Afghanistan was descending into a power vacuum that would ultimately draw the attention and military might of the United States and its allies. The rise of the Taliban in the mid-1990s marked a dramatic shift in Afghanistan's political and cultural landscape. Emerging from the chaos of the Afghan civil war, the Taliban, a movement rooted in radical Islamic ideology, rapidly gained control over large swaths of the country, eventually seizing Kabul in 1996. Their rule was characterized by brutal enforcement of Sharia law, the oppression of women, and the eradication of cultural and religious diversity. Despite their severe policies, the Taliban's initial promise of stability in a fractured nation earned them both supporters and, to a degree, passive acceptance within parts of Afghan society. During this same period, al-Qaeda, under the leadership of Osama bin Laden, found sanctuary within Taliban-controlled territory. Expelled from Sudan in 1996, bin Laden sought refuge in Afghanistan, where he built training camps, recruited fighters, and plotted attacks against Western interests. The Taliban, while not directly involved in al-Qaeda's global operations, provided the terrorist network with the space and protection it needed to grow. Intelligence agencies around the world began to raise alarms, but the decentralized nature of terrorism, combined with the geopolitical complexities of the region, limited any cohesive or immediate response. The international community, meanwhile, largely underestimated the threat. The bombing of U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania in 1998, and the attack on the USS Cole in 2000, were stark warnings of al-Qaeda's ambitions and capabilities. However, these incidents, while tragic, did not yet provoke a large-scale military response. The world continued to grapple with the blurred lines between insurgency, terrorism, and state-sponsored extremism. As 2001 approached, a storm was brewing. The United States, still grappling with post-Cold War foreign policy challenges, began to shift its focus toward asymmetric threats, those posed not by rival states but by stateless actors and decentralized networks. Afghanistan, with its rugged terrain and weak central government, had become the ideal breeding ground for such forces. In retrospect, it was not a question of if the US would intervene but when. The rise of the Taliban. The rise of the Taliban in Afghanistan was both swift and deeply rooted in the chaos that followed decades of war. After the Soviet Union withdrew from Afghanistan in 1989, the country fell into disarray. Mujahideen factions, once united against a common enemy, turned on each other in a brutal civil war. Kabul, the capital, became a battleground for rival warlords vying for control, while the central government dissolved into irrelevance. Amid this turmoil, the Taliban emerged in the southern city of Kandahar in 1994, promising to restore order and enforce Islamic law. The Taliban's ranks were largely composed of religious students, many of them orphans of war, who had been educated in conservative Islamic schools or madrasas in Pakistan. These students, led by Mullah Muhammad Omar, were disillusioned by the lawlessness and corruption that dominated Afghanistan in the early 1990s. With the support of local communities, tired of warlord rule, the Taliban quickly gained popularity by offering swift justice and a harsh but predictable legal code rooted in their strict interpretation of Sunni Islam. As the Taliban advanced, they faced minimal resistance. Their rise was further aided by support from Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence (ISI), which saw the group as a way to establish strategic depth in Afghanistan. Additionally, funding and resources flowed in from other sympathetic states and private donors across the region. Within 2 years of their formation, the Taliban had taken control of Kabul in 1996, and by 1998, they controlled approximately 90% of the country. Once in power, the Taliban instituted an extreme version of Islamic law. Public executions, amputations, and floggings became common forms of punishment. Women were banned from working, receiving education, or even leaving their homes without a male guardian. Television, music, and other forms of entertainment were outlawed, and religious minorities were persecuted. Despite this repression, the Taliban maintained a semblance of order and security that had been absent during the Civil War years, which earned them continued, if uneasy, support in some parts of Afghanistan. Internationally, the Taliban faced widespread condemnation for their human rights abuses and their harboring of terrorist organizations, most notably Al-Qaeda. The Taliban's refusal to hand over Osama bin Laden after the 1998 U.S. embassy bombings marked them as a growing threat to global security. By the time they were overthrown in 2001, the Taliban had become emblematic of extremism, authoritarianism, and the complex challenges of state building in a fractured nation. Al-Qaeda's growing influence. As the Taliban solidified their control over Afghanistan in the late 1990s, a far more insidious force was quietly expanding its reach: Al-Qaeda. Founded by Osama bin Laden in the late 1980s, during the Soviet-Afghan War, Al-Qaeda originally operated as a network supporting jihadist fighters. However, following the war, its ambitions evolved dramatically. Bin Laden envisioned a global Islamist movement, dedicated to the violent expulsion of Western influence from Muslim-majority countries, and the establishment of a transnational Islamic caliphate. After being expelled from Sudan in 1996, bin Laden returned to Afghanistan, where the Taliban granted him safe haven in exchange for financial support and military expertise. From remote mountain bases and hidden compounds, Al-Qaeda began to train thousands of fighters in guerrilla warfare, explosives, and ideological indoctrination. These training camps became crucial hubs for radicalizing recruits and preparing them for operations around the world. During this time, Al-Qaeda transitioned from a loosely organized support group to a centralized command structure capable of executing sophisticated coordinated attacks. The 1998 U.S. embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania marked a turning point, killing over 200 people and wounding thousands. These attacks were a grim showcase of Al-Qaeda's capabilities and a warning of its deadly intent. The group's rhetoric also grew bolder, with bin Laden releasing fatwas calling for attacks on Americans and their allies, both civilian and military. Despite these escalating threats, Al-Qaeda remained largely underestimated by much of the global intelligence community. Part of the challenge lay in its structure. It was not a traditional state actor with a formal army, but a shadowy network of cells spread across continents, capable of acting autonomously while following a unified ideological directive. The Taliban's protection, coupled with the remoteness of Afghanistan's terrain, gave Al-Qaeda the strategic depth and security to expand its influence without significant interference. Al-Qaeda's ideology also began to find fertile ground beyond Afghanistan. Through propaganda, satellite communications, and emerging internet channels, it attracted disaffected youths from across the Middle East, North Africa, and even Western countries. These recruits saw in bin Laden a charismatic figure standing up to global powers, and in Afghanistan, a sanctuary where they could train and prepare for jihad. By 2001, Al-Qaeda had grown into the most dangerous and sophisticated terrorist organization in the world. Its network spanned dozens of countries, its operatives were capable of large-scale terror operations, and its leadership had devised a strategy that would soon culminate in the most devastating terrorist attack in history, the September 11th attacks. The world before 9/11. Before the morning of September 11, 2001, the global landscape was vastly different. The post-Cold War era was defined by a sense of unchallenged American dominance, economic optimism, and the rapid spread of globalization. The 1990s had ended on a relatively high note for the West, especially for the United States, which emerged from the Cold War as the world's sole superpower. In this climate, national security threats were perceived more in terms of rogue states and regional conflicts than decentralized terror networks. Throughout the 1990s, the United States focused its foreign policy on diplomacy, economic expansion, and limited military engagements. Peacekeeping missions in the Balkans, humanitarian interventions in places like Somalia, and the enforcement of no-fly zones over Iraq defined the decade's military posture. Terrorism, while a growing concern, was often viewed as a distant threat, tragic but not existential. The attacks on the World Trade Center in 1993 and the embassy bombings in 1998 were shocking, yet did not prompt a significant change in global security policy. Americans, in particular, lived with a strong sense of security. There had not been a major attack on U.S. soil since Pearl Harbor in 1941, and the nation's borders felt impenetrable to most citizens. Air travel, though protected by basic security checks, was characterized by ease and accessibility. Intelligence agencies, such as the CIA and FBI, were aware of al-Qaeda's growing capabilities, but coordination between agencies was limited, and the threat did not seem imminent. The idea that a non-state actor could hijack civilian planes and use them as weapons against symbolic targets in the heart of the US was at the time inconceivable to most. Globally, a sense of complacency also pervaded international relations. Europe was focused on building the European Union, Russia was grappling with post-Soviet instability, and China was beginning its economic rise. The Middle East remained a region of concern due to long-standing conflicts, but the broader narrative was one of economic liberalization and international cooperation. The rapid growth of the Internet and communication technologies had begun reshaping societies, fostering connections and commerce in unprecedented ways. Yet beneath this surface of relative peace and progress, radical ideologies were fermenting. The disparity between Western prosperity and the grievances of many in the Muslim world created fertile ground for extremist narratives. The world before 9/11 was one that, in hindsight, underestimated the scale and reach of international terrorism. It was a world confident in its systems, blind to the coming storm that would forever alter the global order. Chapter 2, September 11, 2001. September 11, 2001, began like any other day in the United States. Morning commutes, school drop-offs, and the usual routines were unfolding across the country. But at 8:46 a.m. Eastern Time, everything changed. American Airlines Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City, marking the beginning of the deadliest terrorist attack in human history. 17 minutes later, United Airlines Flight 175 struck the South Tower. At 9:37 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77 crashed into the Pentagon. The final hijacked plane, United Airlines Flight 93, was headed for another high-profile target in Washington, D.C., but crashed into a field in Pennsylvania after passengers fought back against the hijackers. The events of that day unfolded live on television, searing themselves into the global consciousness. The images of smoke billowing from the towers, people leaping from windows, and the eventual collapse of both skyscrapers stunned the world. Nearly 3,000 people were killed, including citizens from over 90 countries. First responders rushed into the chaos, many losing their lives as they tried to save others. The attacks exposed not just a physical vulnerability, but a psychological one, the realization that America's sense of security could be shattered so swiftly and devastatingly. In the immediate aftermath, confusion and fear gripped the nation. Commercial air travel was halted for the first time in U.S. history. Streets in major cities emptied as emergency protocols were activated. The search for answers began within hours. While many Americans were just beginning to process what had happened, intelligence and security officials quickly suspected al-Qaeda. Within days, Osama bin Laden emerged as the primary suspect, and evidence mounted that the attacks had been orchestrated from within Afghanistan, where al-Qaeda had been operating freely under Taliban protection. The implications of September 11th were global. Countries around the world expressed solidarity with the US, and NATO invoked Article 5 for the first time in its history, declaring the attack on one member as an attack on all. But beyond diplomacy, the attacks marked a decisive shift in how nations would approach security, terrorism, and international relations. Airport screenings changed forever. Surveillance programs expanded. And within the United States, a renewed sense of patriotism emerged, coupled with fear, suspicion, and anger. September 11th was more than a single day of tragedy. It was a rupture in the modern era, a defining moment that would set in motion a chain of events, culminating in the launch of Operation Enduring Freedom, and a reshaping of the geopolitical world order for generations to come. The day that changed everything. September 11, 2001, has come to be known as the day that changed everything, not only for the United States but for the entire world. In a span of just a few hours, the attacks shattered the illusion of American invulnerability, reshaped global geopolitics, and ushered in a new era of warfare, security, and international policy. It was a moment in which history pivoted, leaving a mark so profound that its effects are still unfolding decades later. For Americans, the trauma of that morning was immediate and deeply personal. The attacks struck at the very heart of the nation's financial, military, and political power. The World Trade Center symbolized economic dominance, the Pentagon represented military strength, and the likely target of United Flight 93, believed to be either the White House or the U.S. Capitol, stood for democratic governance. By choosing these targets, Al-Qaeda was making a statement not only of defiance but of strategic intent, to cripple America's institutions and ignite fear across the globe. The psychological impact of 9/11 cannot be overstated. People around the world watched in disbelief as the towers collapsed, as plumes of smoke rose above Washington, and as emergency crews dug through rubble looking for survivors. The sheer audacity of the attacks, and the fact that they were carried out using hijacked commercial airliners, forced a complete re-evaluation of security norms and intelligence priorities. In the days and weeks that followed, everyday activities like flying, entering government buildings, or even attending public events took on new levels of caution and surveillance. Internationally, the attacks served as a wake-up call. While terrorism had long been a global threat, 9/11 demonstrated that non-state actors could now launch attacks with mass casualty potential, far beyond the scale most governments had previously imagined. Nations around the world rallied in solidarity with the US, not just out of sympathy, but out of a recognition that this kind of threat could reach anyone, anywhere. In political and military terms, the events of that day led directly to a massive shift in US foreign policy. The Bush administration adopted a more aggressive stance toward terrorism, enshrining the doctrine of preemptive strike and laying the groundwork for military operations in Afghanistan and later Iraq. Domestically, the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, the passing of the USA Patriot Act, and sweeping changes in immigration and surveillance policies reshaped American society. September 11th was more than a terrorist attack. It was a global turning point. It redefined national security, reoriented foreign policy, and forced the world to confront a new and terrifying reality, that even the most powerful nations are vulnerable in an interconnected, unpredictable world. Global reactions and fallout. In the immediate aftermath of the September 11th attacks, the world responded with a mix of shock, sorrow, and solidarity. Rarely in modern history had a single event triggered such a unified global reaction. Governments from every corner of the globe condemned the attacks, offering condolences and pledging support to the United States. Vigils were held in cities worldwide, from London to Tokyo to Johannesburg. In places like Tehran, where relations with the US had long been hostile, citizens held candlelight vigils in solidarity with the victims. The sense of shared grief transcended borders, religion, and politics, if only briefly. One of the most significant international responses came from NATO, which, for the first time in its history, invoked Article 5 of its charter. An attack against one member was considered an attack against all. This set the stage for a collective military response, not just from the United States, but from allied nations as well. Across Europe and Asia, countries began tightening security, ramping up intelligence sharing, and preparing for a broader campaign against terrorism. Yet, while there was initial unity, the fallout from 9/11 quickly became more complicated. The United States' declaration of a war on terror, and its focus on preemptive action, began to raise questions around the world. As plans for military intervention in Afghanistan materialized, concerns emerged about civilian casualties, the duration of such operations, and the long-term implications of US military presence in the Middle East and Central Asia. Still, at that time, the majority of the world supported the idea of dismantling Al-Qaeda and holding those responsible accountable. The global fallout wasn't limited to foreign policy and military engagement. Economically, the attacks sent shockwaves through financial markets. Stock exchanges temporarily closed, airlines faced massive losses, and travel industries were brought to a standstill. Politically, new counterterrorism laws and security measures began reshaping civil liberties in countries around the globe. The balance between national security and individual freedoms became a contentious issue, particularly as governments expanded surveillance programs and border controls. Perhaps one of the most enduring global effects was the rise in Islamophobia and racial profiling. Muslim communities, particularly in Western countries, faced increased scrutiny, suspicion, and sometimes outright violence. While many world leaders emphasized the importance of distinguishing between terrorists and ordinary Muslims, fear and misinformation fueled a surge in discrimination that would persist for years. The global reactions to 9/11 reflected both the best and worst of humanity, an outpouring of compassion and unity, followed by complex political, social, and military consequences that continue to shape international relations and domestic policies to this day. Intelligence and accountability. In the wake of the September 11th attacks, intense scrutiny fell on the U.S. intelligence community. How could such a devastating plot be carried out undetected on American soil? The question triggered investigations, hearings, and a deep re-examination of how intelligence agencies operated, not only in the United States but across the globe. What became clear in the aftermath was that the warning signs had been there, but systemic failures in communication, coordination, and prioritization had allowed the plot to unfold unchecked. Prior to 9/11, multiple intelligence agencies had pieces of the puzzle. The CIA, FBI, and NSA had all gathered information on individuals with known ties to Al-Qaeda, including some of the hijackers. However, a lack of interagency cooperation and legal barriers to information sharing created dangerous silos. One agency might know about a suspicious individual's movements, while another held evidence of extremist affiliations, but these insights were never synthesized into a cohesive threat assessment. This fragmentation, in hindsight, proved to be a critical weakness in the intelligence apparatus. The 9/11 Commission, formerly known as the National Commission on Terrorist Attacks upon the United States, was established in 2002 to investigate the failures that led to the tragedy. Its final report, released in 2004, was a damning but necessary analysis. It concluded that while the plot was complex, it could have been thwarted had there been better communication between agencies and a greater sense of urgency about Al-Qaeda's threat. The Commission highlighted missed opportunities to track and detain hijackers who had entered the US legally and were already under surveillance elsewhere. In response to these findings, sweeping reforms were introduced. The most significant was the creation of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, ODNI, to oversee and coordinate the various intelligence agencies. The Department of Homeland Security, DHS, was also established, consolidating 22 federal departments and agencies to improve domestic security. Additionally, laws like the USA Patriot Act expanded the government's surveillance capabilities, sparking a national debate about civil liberties versus national security. Internationally, countries began revamping their intelligence sharing protocols, especially among allies. Multilateral partnerships deepened, with a focus on real-time data exchange, tracking of terrorist financing, and monitoring extremist activity online. Yet even as these reforms improved global readiness, they also exposed deeper ethical concerns about privacy, oversight, and the balance of power between citizens and the state. Ultimately, the post-9/11's intelligence overhaul reflected a painful but necessary lesson. Vigilance must be coupled with accountability. The failure to prevent the attacks was not merely a lapse in data or technology, it was a failure of coordination and judgment. Learning from those mistakes became essential to preventing the next tragedy. Chapter 3: Building a Coalition. In the aftermath of the September 11th attacks, the United States faced the enormous task of not only preparing for military action, but also forging an international coalition to support what would become Operation Enduring Freedom. The urgency to dismantle Al-Qaeda and remove the Taliban from power required not just American force, but a unified front of allies willing to contribute diplomatically, militarily, and logistically. Building this coalition was as much a strategic endeavor as it was a moral one, framed as a global fight against terrorism, rather than a unilateral campaign. President George W. Bush and his administration moved swiftly. Just days after the attacks, Secretary of State Colin Powell began reaching out to allies around the world. The United Kingdom, under Prime Minister Tony Blair, quickly emerged as the most vocal and committed partner, pledging full support and deploying troops alongside the US. Other NATO allies, including Canada, Germany, France, and Italy, followed with offers of troops, intelligence, and logistical aid. NATO's invocation of Article 5 had turned the conflict from an American tragedy into a collective mission. Beyond NATO, the US also reached out to countries in Central and South Asia, particularly Pakistan, which held strategic importance due to its shared border with Afghanistan. After intense diplomatic negotiations, President Pervez Musharraf agreed to provide logistical support, intelligence cooperation, and access to military bases. This was a major shift, given Pakistan's previous ties to the Taliban. The US also coordinated with countries like Uzbekistan, which provided access to airfields critical for launching operations into northern Afghanistan. The coalition that emerged was diverse in scope. Some nations contributed special forces or air support, others provided humanitarian aid, reconstruction funding, or intelligence sharing. Countries in the Middle East offered cautious diplomatic backing, with Saudi Arabia and Jordan supporting counter-terrorism efforts, while balancing their internal political concerns. Even traditionally neutral countries, like Sweden and Switzerland, lent support in non-combat roles. Building this coalition served multiple purposes. Strategically, it ensured broader access to intelligence, staging areas, and military resources. Politically, it helped legitimize the campaign in Afghanistan, signaling that this was not just an American war, but a multinational response to a shared threat. Symbolically, it reinforced the narrative that terrorism was a global menace requiring a united stand. Yet the process was not without challenges. Tensions occasionally surfaced over rules of engagement, burden sharing, and the long-term goals of the mission. But in those critical early weeks, the world came together in a rare moment of unity, laying the foundation for what would become one of the most complex and enduring military coalitions in modern history. Diplomatic maneuvers, and UN involvement. As the United States prepared for military action in Afghanistan, diplomatic efforts were equally critical in ensuring broad international support for the campaign. The Bush administration was determined to make the fight against terrorism a global effort, and part of that strategy involved securing the backing of the United Nations, UN, and international allies. Diplomatic maneuvers played a key role in legitimizing the military intervention, rallying support from nations wary of US dominance or skeptical of the potential for regional destabilization. The United Nations, as the primary forum for international diplomacy, was a central part of these efforts. In the days following the attacks, the US sought to frame the intervention in Afghanistan as part of a broader international campaign against terrorism, not simply an American military operation. The goal was to gain approval for action within the established international order, emphasizing the collective responsibility to combat a global threat. In the aftermath of 9/11, the UN Security Council was quick to respond. On September 12, 2001, just one day after the attacks, the Security Council issued a unanimous statement condemning the assault and calling for those responsible to be brought to justice. In the weeks that followed, the US pushed for a strong international mandate for action. On October 7, 2001, just days before the US launched military operations in Afghanistan, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 1373, which called for all nations to take measures to combat terrorism. The resolution included provisions for the freezing of terrorist funds, the criminalization of support for terrorism, and increased cooperation among member states in intelligence and law enforcement efforts. This resolution was a critical step in creating the legal and diplomatic framework for the US-led invasion of Afghanistan. However, gaining full UN support for military intervention was a more complicated task. While the US had the backing of NATO and many Western and Middle Eastern allies, it still faced the challenge of ensuring that military action had the legitimacy and consensus needed to proceed. Several countries, including Russia, China, and some of the Central Asian republics, were cautious about the implications of US military presence in Afghanistan and the broader region. These countries were concerned about the stability of their own borders and the long-term consequences of a prolonged American military engagement in Central Asia. Despite these concerns, the US successfully navigated the diplomatic landscape, leveraging both UN resolutions and bilateral agreements to create a coalition of support for military action. This diplomatic groundwork allowed the US to justify its actions as part of a larger, international effort to combat terrorism. While the UN did not authorize the invasion of Afghanistan outright, its support for a broader counterterrorism strategy helped to solidify the international legitimacy of the operation, marking a significant moment in the UN's involvement in global security issues. NATO's role and support. Following the September 11 attacks, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, found itself at a historic crossroads. For the first time in its history, NATO invoked Article 5 of its treaty, which states that an attack on one member is considered an attack on all. This unanimous decision to support the United States marked a significant shift in the alliance's role and solidified NATO's commitment to collective defense in the face of non-state threats, such as terrorism. NATO's involvement in the Afghanistan conflict was pivotal, both strategically and symbolically. The alliance's decision to invoke Article 5 was a direct response to the magnitude of the September 11 attacks. It signaled a collective, transatlantic commitment to confront al-Qaeda and dismantle the Taliban regime that harbored the terrorist group. NATO's backing of the US allowed the alliance to broaden its mission beyond traditional defense against state actors to include counterterrorism and peacekeeping operations. In practical terms, NATO's role evolved quickly. The US-led coalition initially began the airstrikes and ground operations in Afghanistan, but NATO soon took on a critical role in the aftermath of the initial military campaign. In December 2001, NATO began deploying its forces to support the establishment of a new Afghan government under the framework of the United Nations Bonn Agreement. This transition to a peacekeeping mission marked NATO's first ever operational deployment outside of Europe. NATO's International Security Assistance Force, ISAF, was established in 2003, tasked with maintaining security and rebuilding Afghanistan in the wake of the US-led invasion. Over the years, NATO forces provided not only military support, but also training for Afghan security forces, reconstruction efforts, and humanitarian assistance. The alliance's contribution was vital in helping stabilize the country during the early years of the post-Taliban era. Additionally, NATO countries, including the United Kingdom, Germany, and Canada, contributed troops to various regions of Afghanistan, each assuming responsibility for different sectors of the country. However, NATO's involvement in Afghanistan was not without challenges. The mission was long, complex, and at times controversial. Some NATO members were hesitant to engage in combat operations, while others struggled with the logistical challenges of operating in Afghanistan's rugged terrain. The alliance also faced difficulties in coordinating a coherent strategy among member states, each with differing priorities and levels of commitment. Despite these challenges, NATO's role in Afghanistan represented a new chapter for the alliance, pushing it to adapt to the evolving nature of global security threats. The war in Afghanistan forced NATO to broaden its scope from a defensive military alliance to an organization involved in nation-building, counterinsurgency, and counterterrorism. The mission demonstrated NATO's capacity for collective action and reinforced its relevance in the 21st century, even as it highlighted the complexities of dealing with non-state actors and asymmetric warfare. Regional allies and challenges. In the fight against the Taliban and al-Qaeda, the United States and its NATO allies relied heavily on regional partners to provide logistical support, intelligence, and access to critical military infrastructure. The role of these regional allies was indispensable to the success of the campaign in Afghanistan, but working with them was not without its challenges. The geopolitical dynamics of Central Asia, the Middle East, and South Asia complicated the situation, as nations balanced their strategic interests, regional security concerns, and relations with the US. One of the most pivotal regional allies was Pakistan. Given its geographic proximity to Afghanistan and its historical ties to the Taliban, Pakistan's cooperation was crucial for the success of the operation. The US managed to convince President Pervez Musharraf to switch allegiances and abandon his support for the Taliban, a significant diplomatic victory. In return, Pakistan received economic and military aid, as well as assurances of US support in dealing with internal threats from insurgent groups. However, Pakistan's involvement was fraught with complications. While it facilitated the US operation by providing access to air bases and intelligence, there were ongoing concerns about its duplicity, with some factions within Pakistan's military and intelligence services continuing to support Taliban elements. This ambiguity led to tensions between the US and Pakistan, as the latter's commitment to the fight against terrorism remained inconsistent. In addition to Pakistan, several Central Asian republics provided logistical support, allowing NATO forces to stage operations and resupply troops. Countries like Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan granted the US access to their airfields, enabling American forces to conduct operations in northern Afghanistan. These countries, many of which had tenuous relationships with Russia, viewed the US presence as an opportunity to bolster their own security and assert their influence in the region. However, their cooperation was often cautious, as they feared that prolonged American military presence might upset regional power balances and embolden separatist movements. Another key regional player was the government of India. Although India was not directly involved in military operations in Afghanistan, it was a strong supporter of the US-led effort to dismantle al-Qaeda and remove the Taliban. India viewed the Taliban as a destabilizing force in the region, and was particularly concerned about Pakistan's role in Afghanistan. As a result, India offered significant diplomatic and humanitarian support, while also expanding its influence through developmental projects in Afghanistan. However, India's support was balanced by its strategic competition with Pakistan, complicating the broader regional dynamics. Despite the vital contributions of these regional allies, their cooperation came with challenges. Their often divergent interests and priorities meant that coordination between the US and these nations was difficult, especially when it came to long-term stability and governance in Afghanistan. As the conflict dragged on, regional rivalries, especially between Pakistan and India, as well as the internal political instability of many of these nations, often hindered the overall effectiveness of the coalition. These challenges underscored the complexities of relying on regional allies, whose interests were not always aligned with the overarching goals of the US and NATO in Afghanistan. Chapter 4: Operation Enduring Freedom begins. On October 7, 2001, the United States officially launched Operation Enduring Freedom, marking the beginning of a military campaign aimed at dismantling al-Qaeda and removing the Taliban from power in Afghanistan. The operation was a direct response to the September 11 attacks, and its primary objective was to target the terrorist network that had carried out the devastating assault on American soil. The campaign was launched just weeks after the attacks, reflecting the urgency with which the US sought to eliminate the threat posed by al-Qaeda and its Taliban hosts. The operation commenced with a series of airstrikes aimed at Taliban military infrastructure, training camps, and al-Qaeda camps. The initial phase was characterized by precision bombing and the use of American and British aircraft to weaken the Taliban's control over key regions of Afghanistan. The US also deployed special forces teams to carry out targeted operations, including searches for high-value al-Qaeda targets and Taliban leadership. These early airstrikes and special forces operations were intended to decimate the Taliban's command and control, as well as disrupt al-Qaeda's training and logistical networks. Simultaneously, the US worked to bolster the Afghan opposition forces, primarily the Northern Alliance, which had been fighting the Taliban for years. The Northern Alliance, composed of various ethnic and political groups, received significant U.S. support in the form of arms, funding, and training. This partnership allowed the U.S. to indirectly confront the Taliban on the ground, while American forces focused on air and special operations. The cooperation with the Northern Alliance was instrumental in enabling the Taliban to lose key territory quickly, particularly in northern Afghanistan. In addition to military actions, the US and its allies launched a comprehensive humanitarian and diplomatic campaign. The humanitarian aspect of the operation aimed to provide aid to the Afghan people, who had suffered under the harsh rule of the Taliban. International organizations and NGOs were mobilized to provide food, medical supplies, and shelter to the displaced population. The diplomatic component of the operation was also crucial, as the US sought to secure international support for the military intervention and to build a coalition of nations committed to long-term counterterrorism efforts. The early days of Operation Enduring Freedom were marked by rapid success on the battlefield, as Taliban forces, who had been weakened by years of internal strife, struggled to respond effectively to the onslaught. Major cities, including Kabul, fell into the hands of the Northern Alliance and US forces by December 2001. However, despite these successes, the operation was far from over. The Taliban and al-Qaeda forces, though driven out of major cities, were still entrenched in the country's rural areas and mountains, and the US was faced with the challenge of preventing a resurgence while attempting to stabilize the country. The beginning of Operation Enduring Freedom set the tone for the long and complex conflict that would follow. While the initial military objectives were achieved with impressive speed, the broader goals of rebuilding Afghanistan, defeating al-Qaeda, and ensuring long-term stability proved to be far more difficult. The operation's launch was just the first step in a protracted and challenging campaign that would evolve into one of the longest conflicts in American history. Launching the invasion. On October 7, 2001, just under a month after the September 11 attacks, the United States, backed by its NATO allies, officially launched the invasion of Afghanistan, marking the start of what would become a prolonged and complex conflict. The operation, named Operation Enduring Freedom, was set in motion with the objective of dismantling al-Qaeda's terrorist network and removing the Taliban regime that had provided sanctuary to Osama bin Laden and his followers. The invasion was a multifaceted military campaign, combining the might of American airpower with ground support from international and Afghan opposition forces. At the outset, the strategy was clear: disrupt the Taliban's control of the country, eliminate al-Qaeda training camps, and eradicate the infrastructure that supported both the Taliban and the terrorist group. American airstrikes were the first visible sign of the invasion, as US bombers and fighter jets began pounding Taliban military positions, airfields, and al-Qaeda facilities. The aerial bombardment was designed to weaken the Taliban's ability to organize and counterattack, while also creating the necessary conditions for ground operations. In parallel with the airstrikes, US Special Forces, along with the CIA and other intelligence agencies, moved into Afghanistan to coordinate with local Afghan forces, primarily the Northern Alliance, which had been fighting the Taliban for years. The Northern Alliance, an anti-Taliban coalition of various ethnic groups, became an essential partner in the invasion, providing crucial ground support as the US forces sought to oust the Taliban from key cities and strongholds. The alliance's fighters, who knew the terrain and had a deep understanding of the local dynamics, proved invaluable in the early phases of the invasion. The speed and effectiveness of the initial phase of the invasion were remarkable. Within weeks, US and Allied forces captured several major cities, including Kabul, the capital. By December 2001, the Taliban regime had largely collapsed in urban centers, and many of its leaders fled to the mountainous regions in the south and east, where the US forces would have to continue the fight. Despite the quick success in urban areas, the Taliban and al-Qaeda fighters retreated into the rugged terrain of Afghanistan, where they would regroup and wage a protracted insurgency. The invasion, however, was not just a military operation. It was also a diplomatic and humanitarian effort. The US sought to build an international coalition, bringing together a wide array of countries that offered not just military support, but also resources for reconstruction and humanitarian aid. International organizations, including the United Nations, were brought in to help with the post-conflict rebuilding of Afghanistan, which included setting up a new government and aiding a population ravaged by years of war and Taliban rule. Despite the initial military successes, the challenges of launching and sustaining the invasion were only beginning. The rapid collapse of the Taliban was followed by the equally daunting task of stabilizing Afghanistan and ensuring that the country would not fall back into the hands of extremists. The launch of the invasion set in motion a series of events that would unfold over the next 2 decades, with the US and its allies struggling to balance military objectives, nation-building, and counter-terrorism efforts in an increasingly volatile region. Airstrikes and initial ground forces. The first phase of Operation Enduring Freedom was marked by a rapid and relentless combination of airstrikes and ground operations aimed at crippling the Taliban's military capabilities and diminishing al-Qaeda's presence in Afghanistan. The US military relied heavily on its superior airpower to achieve immediate success in disrupting Taliban defenses, while ground forces, primarily special operations teams and allied Afghan militias, played a crucial role in securing strategic areas and providing intelligence for continued operations. The initial airstrikes began on October 7, 2001, and targeted key Taliban military sites, including airfields, radar stations, and command centers. US bombers, fighter jets, and Tomahawk cruise missiles carried out precision strikes with the goal of weakening the Taliban's infrastructure and degrading its ability to respond. The use of high-tech weapons, such as the Joint Direct Attack Munition (JDAM), allowed for pinpoint accuracy, minimizing collateral damage while maximizing the effectiveness of the attacks. These strikes quickly incapacitated the Taliban's air defense systems and military infrastructure, setting the stage for ground operations. While airpower created the necessary conditions for a military victory, ground forces were crucial to consolidating gains and pushing the Taliban from key cities. The US deployed Special Operations Forces and CIA agents to work with local Afghan fighters from the Northern Alliance, an anti-Taliban coalition made up of ethnic groups such as Tajiks, Uzbeks, and Hazaras. These forces were able to capitalize on their knowledge of the terrain, the local population, and the Taliban's weaknesses to launch successful ground offensives. With US air support, the Northern Alliance quickly gained ground in the north and central Afghanistan, eventually capturing the capital, Kabul, in November 2001. In addition to the Northern Alliance, US forces provided air support to local militias and small Afghan resistance groups. This cooperation between American Special Forces and Afghan fighters proved to be a vital element in the success of the invasion. US ground forces, though not as large as the air campaign, were able to secure strategic locations and provide logistical support to local fighters, who took control of towns and villages across the country. Despite the initial success, the Taliban and al-Qaeda retreated into Afghanistan's mountainous regions, where they could regroup and continue to resist. The combination of air superiority and ground support laid the foundation for the next phase of the operation, which would focus on counterinsurgency efforts and the long-term stabilization of Afghanistan. The early airstrikes and ground operations provided a clear victory in the short term, but the US quickly realized that the road to lasting peace and security would be much more challenging. CIA and Special Forces on the ground. In the early days of Operation Enduring Freedom, the role of the CIA and Special Forces was pivotal in the success of the mission. While the US military's overwhelming airpower played a central role in weakening the Taliban and al-Qaeda, it was the efforts of the CIA and elite Special Forces units on the ground that were crucial in shaping the course of the invasion. The CIA's presence in Afghanistan was not new. Even before the official launch of Operation Enduring Freedom, the agency had established contacts with Afghan rebel groups, particularly the Northern Alliance, which had been fighting the Taliban since 1996. In the immediate aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, the CIA's paramilitary division, known as the Special Activities Division (SAD), was tasked with working closely with these local forces. The CIA operatives were among the first to enter Afghanistan, providing intelligence and coordinating airstrikes in support of ground forces. The agency's deep knowledge of the region, coupled with its network of informants, enabled them to pinpoint critical Taliban and al-Qaeda targets for the U.S. military. In addition to the CIA, U.S. Special Forces, particularly Navy SEALs, Army Green Berets, and Delta Force, played a crucial role in the ground campaign. These elite units worked alongside Afghan fighters, providing training, guidance, and direct combat support. They also specialized in conducting high-risk, targeted operations to capture or kill key Taliban and al-Qaeda leaders. The Special Forces teams used their knowledge of unconventional warfare and small unit tactics to disrupt Taliban operations and target al-Qaeda's leadership. One of the key advantages of using Special Forces and CIA operatives was their ability to operate in small, agile teams. They could navigate the rugged Afghan terrain, often on horseback, to gain intelligence and coordinate with local resistance groups. This flexibility allowed them to operate effectively in areas where conventional military forces would have struggled. Their efforts were also vital in securing critical locations, such as airfields and supply routes, and ensuring that Afghan forces could hold these territories against Taliban counterattacks. While the CIA and Special Forces were essential in the early successes of the invasion, their work also laid the groundwork for the longer, more complex counterinsurgency campaign that would follow. Their operations disrupted Taliban leadership and sowed confusion within the ranks, contributing to the rapid collapse of the Taliban in key urban areas. However, as the conflict dragged on, these forces would continue to play a crucial role in tracking down insurgents and preventing al-Qaeda from regrouping. The combination of intelligence gathering, targeted operations, and strategic partnerships with local forces proved to be a defining feature of the campaign in Afghanistan. Chapter 5: Fall of the Taliban. The fall of the Taliban was one of the earliest and most significant outcomes of Operation Enduring Freedom. Within weeks of the operation's launch in October 2001, the Taliban regime, which had ruled Afghanistan since 1996, began to collapse under the combined weight of U.S. airstrikes, ground operations by Special Forces, and the support of local Afghan militias, primarily the Northern Alliance. The swift and decisive nature of the Taliban's defeat was a testament to the effectiveness of the coalition's military strategy and the weakness of the Taliban's hold over much of the country. The initial phase of the operation, marked by airstrikes and covert operations by the CIA and U.S. Special Forces, severely crippled the Taliban's command and control. The regime's military infrastructure, which was already weakened by years of internal strife and international isolation, was further dismantled by precision bombing and targeted operations. Key cities like Kandahar, the Taliban stronghold, and Mazar-i-Sharif in the north, quickly fell into the hands of US-backed Afghan forces. The momentum of the US and Afghan coalition forces overwhelmed the Taliban's ability to regroup and resist. However, the fall of the Taliban was not a simple or immediate event. While the cities fell rapidly, many Taliban fighters retreated into Afghanistan's mountainous regions, where they could reorganize and continue to wage a guerrilla-style insurgency. Despite the collapse of their central government, the Taliban's leaders remained elusive, with some escaping to neighboring Pakistan, where they would regroup and later launch an insurgency that would drag on for years. In the aftermath of the Taliban's collapse, the US and its allies focused on stabilizing Afghanistan and ensuring that the country would not fall back into the hands of extremists. This involved the establishment of a new interim government under Hamid Karzai, the rebuilding of infrastructure, and efforts to secure the country against the remnants of Taliban forces and al-Qaeda operatives who had scattered across the region. The fall of the Taliban marked the beginning of a new chapter for Afghanistan, but the victory was far from complete. While the Taliban was removed from power, the challenges of nation building, securing the country, and combating the insurgency would persist. The short-lived triumph over the Taliban was followed by a prolonged and difficult struggle to prevent Afghanistan from becoming a haven for terrorism once again. Battle for Kabul. The Battle for Kabul was a pivotal moment in the early stages of Operation Enduring Freedom, marking the eventual collapse of the Taliban regime and the capture of Afghanistan's capital by US and Afghan forces. Kabul had been under Taliban control since 1996, and its fall was symbolic of the crumbling of the Taliban's power. The assault on the city, however, was far from straightforward, and involved a combination of intense airstrikes, ground fighting, and political maneuvering. In the days leading up to the battle, US and coalition forces intensified their airstrikes on Taliban positions throughout Kabul and its surrounding areas. The Taliban, realizing they could no longer hold off the onslaught, began to lose their grip on the capital. While the city was heavily defended by Taliban forces, the combination of US bombings, which targeted military infrastructure and supply lines, and ground advances by local militias left the regime unable to maintain control. The ground assault on Kabul was largely spearheaded by the Northern Alliance, an anti-Taliban coalition that had long resisted the Taliban's rule. Although they were a diverse group of ethnic and political factions, they shared a common goal of ousting the Taliban. With support from US special forces and airstrikes, the Northern Alliance fighters began pushing into Kabul's outskirts. The battle was marked by fierce urban fighting, as Taliban soldiers attempted to defend key locations within the city, including military bases and government buildings. By November 13, 2001, Taliban forces began to abandon Kabul, and the Northern Alliance fighters entered the city with little resistance. This marked the beginning of the end for the Taliban's rule over Afghanistan. As Kabul fell, Hamid Karzai, a key figure in the anti-Taliban resistance, was chosen to lead the interim government, paving the way for a new political landscape in Afghanistan. The battle for Kabul was not only a military victory, but also a significant psychological blow to the Taliban. It symbolized the collapse of their authority in the country, signaling the beginning of the US and NATO-led efforts to stabilize Afghanistan. However, while the battle for the capital was decisive, the war was far from over. The Taliban retreated to the rural areas and mountains, where they would continue to wage an insurgency for years to come. Collapse of Kandahar. The collapse of Kandahar, the birthplace and spiritual heart of the Taliban, was a critical turning point in the early stages of Operation Enduring Freedom. The city, located in southern Afghanistan, had been the Taliban's stronghold and the center of their power for most of their rule. Kandahar was where Mullah Omar, the Taliban's leader, and other senior figures established their headquarters, making its fall a symbolic and military victory for US and coalition forces. In the immediate aftermath of the September 11 attacks, Kandahar became a focal point for the US military's efforts to eliminate the Taliban regime. The operation to capture or neutralize the Taliban forces in Kandahar was challenging due to the city's strategic importance and its large, heavily armed Taliban presence. Kandahar was also well fortified, with many of the Taliban's most experienced fighters entrenched within the city's defenses and surrounding areas. However, the Taliban's hold on the city was weakened by a combination of relentless US airstrikes and the pressure exerted by advancing Afghan militias. By November 2001, US and coalition forces, in collaboration with the Northern Alliance and other local resistance groups, had pushed deep into southern Afghanistan. Airstrikes intensified in the region, targeting Taliban leadership, training camps, and military infrastructure. US bombers dropped precision-guided munitions on key positions, including the city's airport, Taliban barracks, and weapon storage facilities. The strategic objective was to cripple the Taliban's ability to coordinate a defense, disrupt supply lines, and force the leadership to flee or surrender. The fall of Kandahar came in early December 2001, after weeks of heavy fighting. As US forces closed in, the Taliban's resistance began to falter. Mullah Omar and other senior leaders, realizing the imminent collapse of their stronghold, fled to the mountainous regions of southern Afghanistan and into Pakistan. While some pockets of Taliban fighters continued to resist in the surrounding rural areas, the capture of Kandahar effectively marked the end of the Taliban's control over Afghanistan's major cities. The collapse of Kandahar had profound implications for both the Taliban and the international community. For the Taliban, losing their spiritual and logistical hub was a devastating blow. For the US and its allies, it was a significant victory, signaling that the mission to dismantle the Taliban regime was nearing completion. However, the retreat of Taliban forces into the mountainous regions signaled that the struggle was far from over. The insurgency that would follow would continue to challenge US and NATO forces for years to come. Despite the loss at Kandahar, the Taliban remained a potent force in Afghanistan, and the war shifted from conventional battles to a more elusive and dangerous form of guerrilla warfare. Taliban leadership in hiding. After the collapse of Kabul and Kandahar in late 2001, the Taliban leadership, particularly Mullah Omar and other senior figures, went into hiding, marking the beginning of the insurgency that would plague Afghanistan for years. Despite losing their control over key cities, the Taliban's leadership did not fall with the regime. Instead, they retreated into the rugged and remote areas of Afghanistan and neighboring Pakistan, where they could regroup, reorganize, and continue to exert influence over their followers. Mullah Omar, the supreme leader of the Taliban, became a symbol of resistance and an elusive target for US forces. His ability to remain hidden, despite an extensive manhunt by the CIA and US military, demonstrated the challenges of fighting an insurgency in such a complex terrain. The mountainous regions of southern Afghanistan, particularly along the border with Pakistan, provided the perfect sanctuary for the Taliban leadership. The porous border between the two countries allowed Taliban leaders to move freely between safe havens, making it difficult for the US to fully eliminate their leadership. The US and coalition forces employed various strategies to locate and capture or kill the remaining Taliban leaders. These included special operations raids, aerial surveillance, and the use of local informants. However, the Taliban leadership remained elusive, often operating in small, highly secretive groups. Their ability to communicate through covert means and maintain connections with fighters and sympathizers throughout the region helped sustain the Taliban's presence in Afghanistan despite the loss of major cities. During this period of hiding, the Taliban leadership continued to inspire and direct the insurgency. They were able to maintain control over a significant portion of the Afghan population, especially in rural areas where the Taliban's influence had been deeply entrenched prior to the invasion. Taliban leaders provided a sense of stability and continuity for those who had lived under their rule, further fueling the resistance to US and NATO forces. The leadership's ability to remain in hiding was not just a testament to their evasion tactics, but also highlighted the complex nature of the conflict in Afghanistan. While the US and its allies focused on capturing or killing the leadership, the insurgency shifted from a conventional military struggle to a long-term asymmetric warfare campaign. The Taliban's leadership, though in hiding, was far from defeated, and their role in the insurgency would continue to shape the future of Afghanistan for the next 2 decades. Chapter 6: The Hunt for Osama bin Laden. The hunt for Osama bin Laden became one of the most intense and high-priority missions of the US during and after Operation Enduring Freedom. As the mastermind behind the September 11th attacks, bin Laden was seen as the primary target of the US military and intelligence efforts in Afghanistan. His capture or death was viewed as essential for bringing justice to the victims of 9/11 and dismantling al-Qaeda's leadership. The search, however, would prove to be a complex and elusive pursuit, lasting for nearly a decade. In the immediate aftermath of the invasion of Afghanistan, the US military and intelligence agencies were focused on locating bin Laden, who had been hiding in the country. Intelligence suggested that bin Laden had been in the Tora Bora cave complex in eastern Afghanistan, a mountainous region near the Pakistan border. The US forces, in coordination with Afghan militias, launched a major assault on Tora Bora in December 2001. However, despite heavy bombing and ground attacks, bin Laden managed to evade capture. The mountainous terrain, combined with the complex network of caves and tunnels, allowed bin Laden and his followers to slip away into the rugged regions along the Afghan-Pakistani border. After the failure to capture bin Laden at Tora Bora, the hunt for him shifted focus. The US began to rely heavily on intelligence gathering, special operations forces, and the use of drones to track bin Laden's movements. Over the years, various leads came and went, with the US military conducting numerous raids and missions across the region in an attempt to locate him. The search was not limited to Afghanistan. It extended into neighboring Pakistan, where intelligence suggested bin Laden may have found sanctuary, particularly in the tribal areas that were outside the full control of the Pakistani government. The trail grew cold, but in 2010, U.S. intelligence agencies received a breakthrough. They discovered a courier linked to bin Laden, who had been living in a compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan. The compound was a high-security facility that had been under surveillance for several months before being identified as a likely location for bin Laden. This led to a covert mission, Operation Neptune Spear, which was carried out by U.S. Navy SEAL Team 6 in May 2011. The operation resulted in bin Laden's death and the retrieval of crucial intelligence that would further disrupt al-Qaeda's operations. Bin Laden's death was a defining moment in the war on terror and symbolized the US's commitment to pursuing justice for the 9/11 attacks. However, the hunt for bin Laden also highlighted the ongoing complexities of combating terrorism, as it took nearly a decade to finally bring him to justice. Intelligence breakthroughs and challenges. The hunt for Osama bin Laden and the broader effort to dismantle al-Qaeda involved significant intelligence breakthroughs, but also presented complex and ongoing challenges. As the U.S. military sought to eliminate terrorist networks in Afghanistan and Pakistan, gathering accurate intelligence was crucial to the success of operations. However, the task of obtaining reliable information in the rugged terrain of the region, with its widespread distrust of foreign forces, made intelligence gathering exceptionally difficult. One of the earliest breakthroughs in the hunt for bin Laden came from the CIA's ability to infiltrate local networks and gather information from within Afghanistan. Early in the invasion, the CIA worked closely with Afghan resistance groups, especially the Northern Alliance, to collect intelligence on Taliban and al-Qaeda positions. Through their networks of informants, the CIA was able to provide U.S. forces with valuable data on bin Laden's whereabouts and activities. Despite this, there was little concrete information on his exact location, and the initial U.S. strategy to locate bin Laden through conventional means proved insufficient. The next significant breakthrough came in 2002, when U.S. intelligence learned that a key al-Qaeda courier could be linked to bin Laden. This discovery proved pivotal in the years that followed. The identification of the courier's identity allowed the U.S. to track al-Qaeda's movements with greater precision. Through months of surveillance and monitoring communications, U.S. intelligence agents were able to establish a connection to a compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan, where bin Laden was believed to be hiding. This moment represented the culmination of nearly a decade of intelligence gathering efforts. Despite these breakthroughs, the pursuit of bin Laden faced numerous challenges. One of the biggest hurdles was the difficulty of infiltrating al-Qaeda's inner circle. The terrorist group operated with a high degree of secrecy, using encrypted communication methods and code words that made it hard for U.S. agencies to intercept useful intelligence. Moreover, bin Laden and his lieutenants were aware of U.S. tactics, adapting quickly to avoid detection. This constant cat-and-mouse game made intelligence gathering both frustrating and time-consuming. Another challenge was the limited cooperation from Pakistan, where many believed that the country's intelligence services had elements sympathetic to the Taliban or even al-Qaeda. This often made it difficult for U.S. intelligence agencies to share or receive critical information. Additionally, the vast tribal areas of Pakistan, which were beyond the reach of government control, provided safe havens for militants, further complicating efforts to track and neutralize key al-Qaeda figures. In the end, intelligence breakthroughs, combined with the persistence and innovation of U.S. military and intelligence agencies, led to the successful operation that killed Osama bin Laden in 2011. However, the challenges faced during the decade-long hunt highlighted the complexities of modern counterterrorism efforts and the necessity of continuous adaptation to new threats. Tora Bora and the missed opportunity. The Battle of Tora Bora remains one of the most controversial and critical moments in the hunt for Osama bin Laden and the early days of the War on Terror. In December 2001, after the initial stages of Operation Enduring Freedom, US and Allied forces believed they had finally cornered bin Laden in the Tora Bora cave complex, a rugged and strategically important region in eastern Afghanistan near the Pakistan border. However, despite the intelligence that pointed to bin Laden's presence and a sustained military effort, the operation to capture him ultimately failed, resulting in what many consider a missed opportunity to eliminate the leader of al-Qaeda early in the conflict. Tora Bora was a natural fortress, with deep caves and steep terrain that made it a perfect hiding place for bin Laden and his fighters. As the US military, aided by Afghan forces, launched airstrikes and ground operations, the Taliban and al-Qaeda forces holed up in the caves, prepared to defend their position. The US strategy involved heavy bombing campaigns, but the terrain presented significant challenges for ground troops. US forces, including special operations teams, worked with the Afghan Northern Alliance, who had intimate knowledge of the region and its network of caves and tunnels. Despite these advantages, the operation was hampered by a lack of sufficient ground forces and coordination. One of the most significant aspects of the Tora Bora operation was the decision not to commit a larger number of US ground troops to the battle. This has been a point of controversy ever since. Military analysts and critics argue that the lack of a larger ground force gave bin Laden and his followers an opportunity to escape. Intelligence reports indicated that many Taliban and al-Qaeda fighters managed to flee across the porous border into Pakistan, where they could regroup and continue their operations. The failure to fully seal the escape routes, particularly into Pakistan, allowed bin Laden to avoid capture at that critical moment. In addition to the lack of sufficient ground troops, the operation at Tora Bora was marred by political and strategic missteps. There was an over-reliance on Afghan militias to secure the area, and some Afghan commanders were suspected of aiding the Taliban forces, either out of loyalty or under duress. This created an unreliable chain of command, which contributed to the escape of key al-Qaeda figures. The missed opportunity at Tora Bora set the stage for bin Laden's continued evasion and the long pursuit that would follow. While bin Laden's escape was a significant blow to US efforts, it also highlighted the challenges of fighting a shadowy, decentralized terrorist network. The failure to capture him at Tora Bora has remained a critical point of reflection, with many questioning what could have been different if US forces had been better prepared or more aggressive in their approach. Ultimately, the Tora Bora operation underscored the complexity of the fight against terrorism and the challenges of pursuing high-value targets in hostile and unpredictable environments. Bin Laden's escape and aftermath. The escape of Osama bin Laden from the Tora Bora caves in December 2001 marked a turning point in the US effort to dismantle al-Qaeda and a missed opportunity to bring the terrorist mastermind to justice. Despite being cornered in a fortified position, bin Laden managed to evade capture and flee into the mountains, eventually making his way into Pakistan. This escape would have profound consequences, both for the war on terrorism and for US foreign policy, as bin Laden remained at large for nearly another decade, continuing to lead al-Qaeda and inspire global jihadist movements. The immediate aftermath of bin Laden's escape was one of frustration and confusion. The US military had launched a massive offensive at Tora Bora, deploying airstrikes and special forces to flush out al-Qaeda fighters hiding in the cave complex. However, the operation's lack of sufficient ground troops to fully secure the region, combined with poor coordination with Afghan militias, allowed bin Laden and his followers to slip through the net. As the Taliban forces retreated into the mountains, intelligence reports suggested that bin Laden had crossed into Pakistan, a move that would give him a safe haven in the country's largely ungoverned tribal areas. In the months that followed, the US military refocused its efforts on tracking down al-Qaeda operatives and attempting to locate bin Laden. The pursuit of bin Laden became a central component of the war on terror, with the CIA and other intelligence agencies devoting extensive resources to his capture. However, despite numerous attempts to locate him, bin Laden was able to evade capture, living in relative obscurity in the tribal regions of Pakistan. This period of uncertainty allowed al-Qaeda to regroup and plan new attacks, most notably the bombings of US embassies in Africa and the 2004 Madrid train bombings. Bin Laden's escape also had significant implications for U.S. foreign policy. The failure to capture bin Laden was seen as a major setback in the fight against terrorism and a blow to American credibility. The hunt for bin Laden became a symbol of the limitations of U.S. military power, and his continued evasion added to the growing frustration felt by both the U.S. public and military personnel. It also highlighted the complexities of fighting a decentralized terrorist organization, especially when key leaders could move freely across porous borders. It wasn't until May 2011, nearly 10 years later, that bin Laden was located and killed in a U.S. Navy SEAL operation in Abbottabad, Pakistan. His death marked a long-awaited victory in the war on terror, but the years spent chasing him illustrated the profound challenges of counterterrorism and the enduring nature of al-Qaeda's network, even after bin Laden's escape from Tora Bora. Chapter 7: Nation Building and Resistance. The aftermath of the Taliban's initial defeat in 2001 left Afghanistan in a state of devastation and chaos. With the fall of the Taliban regime, the US and its allies shifted their focus to rebuilding Afghanistan, a task that would prove to be just as complex and challenging as the military intervention itself. Nation building, which aimed to establish a stable democratic government, rebuild infrastructure, and restore the rule of law, became a central mission of the US-led coalition. However, the process was met with fierce resistance, not only from remnants of the Taliban, but also from local political factions, warlords, and insurgents who opposed the foreign intervention and the new government. In the early years following the invasion, the US and its allies faced the monumental task of reconstructing Afghanistan from the ground up. The country's infrastructure had been severely damaged during decades of war, first during the Soviet invasion in the 1980s, and then under the brutal civil conflict of the 1990s. Roads, schools, hospitals, and government buildings were destroyed, and much of the population lived in extreme poverty. The international community, led by the US, pledged billions of dollars in aid to rebuild the country. Yet, efforts were often hindered by corruption, inefficiency, and a lack of security in key regions. One of the primary goals of the nation-building effort was to create a functioning, representative government in Kabul. The Bonn Agreement of 2001 set the stage for a new political structure, leading to the establishment of a transitional government headed by Hamid Karzai. However, the government faced numerous obstacles, including the presence of powerful regional warlords who controlled much of the countryside. These warlords often undermined the central government's authority and were seen as corrupt and violent figures. Despite the international community's support, the Karzai administration struggled to assert control over large swaths of the country. As nation-building efforts progressed, resistance to the foreign presence began to grow. The Taliban, although defeated in 2001, was far from vanquished. Over the following years, the group launched a persistent insurgency, using guerrilla tactics to target Afghan and coalition forces. The Taliban found support among rural populations, who had grown disillusioned with the new government's inability to provide security and economic opportunity. As the insurgency spread, it became clear that the mission to rebuild Afghanistan was not only a battle against the Taliban, but also a fight to gain the trust and support of the Afghan people. The resistance to nation building in Afghanistan was not limited to the Taliban. Many Afghans, particularly in the southern and eastern regions, were skeptical of the US-backed government and foreign intervention. Cultural and religious differences, as well as a history of distrust toward outside powers, fueled opposition to the new political order. This resistance, coupled with the difficulties of governance and rebuilding, made Afghanistan one of the most challenging nation-building projects in modern history. Despite the challenges, efforts to rebuild Afghanistan continued throughout the 2000s and 2010s with varying degrees of success. While some progress was made in areas such as education, healthcare, and infrastructure, the overall stability of the country remained precarious. The enduring resistance from the Taliban and other insurgent groups underscored the complexities of establishing lasting peace in a country torn by decades of conflict and instability. Ultimately, the challenge of nation building in Afghanistan demonstrated the limits of military power and the difficulties of transforming a war-torn society into a stable, functioning state. Establishing a new Afghan government. The creation of a new Afghan government was one of the most crucial and difficult tasks following the US invasion of Afghanistan in 2001. After the fall of the Taliban regime, the US and its allies sought to establish a stable democratic government that could replace the oppressive Taliban rule and lead the country toward peace and stability. However, the process of creating this new government faced significant challenges due to Afghanistan's complex political landscape, regional power struggles, and deep cultural divisions. The first step in establishing a new government was the Bonn Agreement of December 2001, which laid the groundwork for Afghanistan's political future. This agreement, brokered by the United Nations, brought together Afghan leaders from various factions, including the Northern Alliance, which had played a key role in the fight against the Taliban. The Bonn Agreement outlined a roadmap for the transition from Taliban rule to a new, inclusive government. It called for the creation of a transitional government, the drafting of a new constitution, and the establishment of democratic elections. Hamid Karzai, a former Taliban opponent and tribal leader, was chosen to head the interim government that emerged from the Bonn Agreement. His selection as the leader of the transitional government was seen as a practical choice, as he was widely respected by various factions within the country, though his authority was limited outside of Kabul. Karzai's government faced an immediate challenge in asserting control over the rest of the country, much of which was still held by warlords and tribal militias who had strong regional influence. The central government's authority was weak, and Karzai's administration struggled to unite the country's various ethnic and tribal groups. Afghanistan is a diverse country, home to Pashtuns, Tajiks, Uzbeks, Hazara, and other ethnic groups, each with its own historical grievances and allegiances. The political framework established by the Bonn Agreement aimed to be inclusive, but it was difficult to balance the interests of these groups while also addressing the power dynamics created by years of conflict. Warlord factions, which had considerable influence in the provinces, often undermined the central government, and many Afghans viewed the new government as a puppet of foreign powers. Another challenge was the lack of infrastructure and resources to support the new government. Years of war, first against the Soviets and then the Taliban, had left the country in ruins. The education system was in shambles, healthcare was minimal, and basic services were severely lacking. The central government had little capacity to govern effectively or provide the necessary services to its citizens, which further eroded its legitimacy. Despite these challenges, the establishment of a new government did lead to some progress. In 2004, Afghanistan held its first presidential election, which resulted in Karzai being elected president. This was a historic moment for the country, marking the first time in decades that the Afghan people had participated in a democratic process. However, the government's success was uneven, and security remained a major issue, particularly in the southern and eastern regions, where the Taliban insurgency was gaining strength. The process of establishing a new government in Afghanistan underscored the complexities of post-conflict nation building. While the creation of a democratic framework was an important step, the challenges of governance, regional power struggles, and security threats continued to plague the country, leaving Afghanistan in a fragile state for years to come. Rise of the insurgency. After the initial success of Operation Enduring Freedom in 2001, and the subsequent fall of the Taliban regime, many believed that the insurgency in Afghanistan was over. However, the reality on the ground was far more complicated. In the years following the US-led invasion, the Taliban regrouped, rearmed, and began to launch an increasingly sophisticated and widespread insurgency against the newly established Afghan government and foreign forces. This insurgency marked a major shift in the conflict, as the Taliban transitioned from a conventional military force to a brutal guerrilla movement, with significant support from local tribes, militias, and even elements of Pakistan's intelligence services. The resurgence of the Taliban insurgency in the mid-2000s was fueled by several factors. One of the key reasons was the dissatisfaction of many rural Afghans with the new Afghan government, which was seen as corrupt and ineffectual. The government's inability to provide basic services, maintain security, and address the needs of its citizens created a fertile ground for the Taliban to gain support among the population. The insurgents capitalized on this discontent by positioning themselves as defenders of Afghan values and opponents of foreign occupation, which resonated with many Afghans who had grown wary of the US and NATO presence. Another factor contributing to the rise of the insurgency was the porous border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. The rugged terrain of the border region allowed the Taliban and other insurgent groups to cross back and forth with relative ease, escaping US and Afghan forces in one country and re-entering the other. Safe havens in Pakistan, particularly in the federally administered tribal areas, FATA, allowed the Taliban to rearm, regroup and train new recruits, making them a more formidable force in the years to come. These safe havens were a source of frustration for US and NATO forces, who struggled to tackle the cross-border insurgency. As the insurgency grew, the Taliban adapted their tactics, increasingly relying on suicide bombings, roadside IEDs, and other asymmetric warfare methods to target Afghan government officials, US and NATO forces and civilians. These tactics were designed to create chaos, instill fear, and undermine the legitimacy of the Afghan government. The insurgency became more violent and widespread, with the Taliban expanding their influence in the southern and eastern parts of Afghanistan, areas that had once been Taliban strongholds. The rise of the insurgency also prompted a shift in US and NATO strategy, with military operations focused on counterinsurgency, coin tactics that emphasized building relationships with local populations, securing key areas and winning hearts and minds. However, the insurgency's persistence and the complex political and ethnic dynamics of Afghanistan made these efforts difficult to implement effectively. By the late 2000s, the insurgency had become a major challenge to the stability of Afghanistan, and the conflict was far from over. The Taliban's ability to regroup, resupply, and maintain their presence highlighted the enduring strength of their insurgency and the difficulty of defeating a decentralized enemy operating in difficult terrain. The rise of the insurgency underscored the challenges of rebuilding a nation after decades of war and foreign intervention. Humanitarian and reconstruction efforts. Following the fall of the Taliban regime in 2001, the international community, led by the United States and its allies, made significant efforts to address Afghanistan's dire humanitarian needs and begin the process of reconstruction. After decades of war, the country was in ruins, with much of its infrastructure destroyed, its education and healthcare systems decimated, and millions of people living in poverty and displacement. The challenge was immense, but humanitarian and reconstruction efforts were seen as key components to building a stable, peaceful Afghanistan and preventing the resurgence of extremism. The first priority for humanitarian organizations was to provide immediate relief to the Afghan population. This included food aid, medical assistance, and shelter for millions of displaced individuals. The United Nations and non-governmental organizations, NGOs, played a central role in these early efforts, providing critical services to communities suffering from the aftermath of years of conflict. The US military also assisted in distributing food and medical supplies, particularly in the most remote and inaccessible regions. With the winter of 2001-2002 approaching, the international community focused on averting a humanitarian disaster, especially among the most vulnerable populations such as women, children, and the elderly. As the situation stabilized somewhat in the following years, reconstruction efforts began in earnest. The US and its allies, including international organizations like the World Bank and the United Nations Development Programme, UNDP, pledged billions of dollars in aid to rebuild Afghanistan's infrastructure. Roads, bridges, schools, and hospitals were rebuilt, and efforts were made to restore basic services such as electricity, water, and sanitation. These projects were vital to the recovery of a country that had been ravaged by war, but the reconstruction process was not without its challenges. Corruption, inefficiency, and a lack of local capacity often delayed progress, and in some cases, aid resources were misused or misallocated. Reconstruction was also hampered by the ongoing security situation. In regions where the Taliban and other insurgent groups had a strong presence, reconstruction efforts were frequently disrupted or destroyed. Insurgents targeted infrastructure projects, making it difficult for international organizations and contractors to operate safely. As a result, many reconstruction efforts were concentrated in the relatively secure areas around Kabul, leaving large parts of the country underdeveloped and vulnerable. Despite these challenges, there were notable successes in Afghanistan's reconstruction, especially in areas like education and health. The number of children attending school increased dramatically, and healthcare services were expanded. Life expectancy also began to rise, and improvements in infrastructure helped boost economic activity in some areas. However, the long-term sustainability of these efforts was often undermined by the unstable security environment and the complex political landscape, which continued to present obstacles to true nation building. Humanitarian and reconstruction efforts in Afghanistan were critical to the country's recovery, but they were not enough to overcome the deep-rooted challenges of governance, security, and regional power struggles. While some progress was made, the fragility of Afghanistan's rebuilding process highlighted the difficulty of stabilizing a war-torn country in the face of persistent insurgency and political instability. Chapter 8: Long War begins. As the dust settled after the initial military success of Operation Enduring Freedom in 2001, it became clear that the situation in Afghanistan was far from resolved. What had started as a swift military intervention against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda evolved into a long, drawn-out conflict that would stretch for nearly 2 decades. The nature of the war changed as insurgent forces, primarily the resurgent Taliban, regrouped and began waging a protracted guerrilla campaign against Afghan and coalition forces. This shift marked the beginning of what would become known as the Long War. The early optimism that Afghanistan would quickly transition into a stable, democratic state began to fade as insurgency operations became more frequent and sophisticated. The Taliban, though defeated in 2001, were never fully eradicated. They maintained strongholds in the south and east of Afghanistan and launched a renewed offensive, using asymmetric warfare tactics such as roadside bombs, ambushes, and suicide attacks to target Afghan security forces, foreign military personnel, and civilians. The presence of NATO and US forces, while initially seen as a stabilizing influence, began to face increasing resistance from insurgent groups, and the conflict's nature began to evolve. The international community initially focused on rebuilding Afghanistan, but without a secure environment, efforts to develop infrastructure, strengthen governance, and promote economic growth were stymied. The Taliban's resurgence was accompanied by the growing influence of other insurgent groups, including Al-Qaeda and local militias, further complicating the security situation. As the insurgency spread, the Afghan government remained fragile, with corruption undermining the legitimacy of state institutions and weakening public trust. The country's complex ethnic, tribal, and political dynamics added layers of difficulty to efforts at creating a unified, cohesive government. Warlord factions, some of whom had been co-opted into the new government structure, held considerable power in their respective regions, often at odds with the central government in Kabul. Over time, the war became a drawn-out conflict with no clear end in sight. The US and NATO forces attempted to shift strategies, moving from large-scale combat operations to counterinsurgency tactics focused on winning the hearts and minds of the Afghan population. However, the sustained presence of foreign troops, coupled with escalating violence, led to mounting casualties and growing opposition back home, especially in the US and NATO member states. The American public and political leadership began questioning the cost of the war, both in human lives and financial resources. As the Long War wore on, Afghanistan became a central front in the broader global fight against terrorism. Yet, despite significant investments in military operations and nation building, the country remained trapped in a cycle of instability, unable to break free from decades of war and conflict. The war in Afghanistan had shifted from a focused intervention to a prolonged, asymmetric conflict with no clear path to resolution, marking the beginning of a long and arduous struggle that would define the country's future for many years to come. Expanding military operations. As the insurgency in Afghanistan gained strength and complexity, US and NATO forces were forced to expand their military operations beyond the initial objectives of dismantling the Taliban regime and defeating al-Qaeda. In the years following the fall of the Taliban, the coalition's military strategy shifted from conventional warfare to counterinsurgency operations aimed at stabilizing Afghanistan and defeating the resurgent Taliban. This shift required a significant increase in military presence and a rethinking of tactics in order to address the growing threat posed by insurgents operating across the country. Initially, military operations were concentrated in major urban centers, particularly Kabul, where the central government and coalition forces could secure key infrastructure and provide humanitarian aid. However, as the Taliban regrouped and insurgent activity spread to rural areas, especially in the southern and eastern provinces, the focus of military operations expanded. The strategy evolved to include joint operations with Afghan National Security Forces, ANSF, which, although still in the process of being trained and equipped, were critical for maintaining security outside Kabul and larger cities. The expansion of military operations also saw an increased reliance on air power, particularly strategic bombing and drone strikes, to target insurgent leaders, supply lines, and training camps. While these airstrikes were effective in disrupting Taliban activities, they also led to significant civilian casualties, which undermined the efforts to win local support. In response, US and NATO forces adjusted their tactics to focus on precision strikes and increased efforts to minimize civilian harm. The increased military presence in rural areas often led to direct clashes between insurgents and coalition forces, with the Taliban using guerrilla tactics such as ambushes and roadside bombs. Despite the growing insurgent resistance, coalition forces expanded their operations to provinces that were once Taliban strongholds. Operations like Operation Anaconda in 2002 and Operation Mountain Storm in 2007 highlighted the shift to large-scale ground combat in an effort to suppress Taliban insurgents and secure key regions. While military operations grew in size and intensity, they were often hindered by the difficult terrain, logistical challenges, and the complex political situation within Afghanistan. The ongoing insurgency, coupled with the challenges of maintaining stability and governance in the country, meant that military operations often had limited success in achieving long-term peace. As the conflict dragged on, military commanders increasingly stressed the importance of integrating military operations with reconstruction efforts, believing that securing the population and fostering development were key to winning the hearts and minds of the Afghan people. The expanding military operations in Afghanistan were a crucial part of the overall strategy to stabilize the country, but they also underscored the difficulty of waging a prolonged war in a complex and hostile environment. Despite significant resources and manpower, the continued spread of insurgent activity demonstrated that military might alone would not be enough to achieve lasting peace. Shifting strategies and surge policies. As the war in Afghanistan entered its second decade, the US and NATO forces recognized that the initial military approach had not yielded the desired results. The insurgency, particularly the Taliban, remained resilient, and the security situation continued to deteriorate. By 2009, it was clear that a new strategy was needed to break the deadlock and improve the chances of success. This period marked the beginning of significant shifts in military strategy, including the implementation of surge policies aimed at reversing the Taliban's momentum and stabilizing the country. The shift in strategy was largely influenced by a change in US leadership. President Barack Obama, elected in 2008, faced mounting pressure to address the challenges in Afghanistan. His administration adopted a new approach that emphasized counterinsurgency coin tactics, which focused on protecting the population, rebuilding trust in the government, and targeting the insurgents with precision operations. This strategy was designed to reduce civilian casualties and build local support by securing key areas and improving governance. In late 2009, President Obama authorized a surge of additional US troops to Afghanistan. The surge aimed to increase the number of American forces in the country, particularly in the volatile southern and eastern provinces where the Taliban was strongest. This surge was intended to provide the necessary manpower to conduct counterinsurgency operations more effectively and support the Afghan government's efforts to assert control over insurgent-controlled areas. The plan also focused on providing security to the civilian population, which had been increasingly caught in the crossfire of the conflict. The surge brought approximately 30,000 additional U.S. troops to Afghanistan, boosting the overall troop count to around 100,000 by 2010. The goal was to use these forces to establish a strong security presence, disrupt the Taliban's operations, and give Afghan forces time to develop the capacity to take over security responsibilities. However, despite the increased military presence, the surge did not lead to an immediate and decisive shift in the war's trajectory. Insurgency attacks continued, and while some regions saw temporary improvements in security, the overall instability persisted. One of the challenges of the surge strategy was the difficulty of securing long-term gains. The Taliban's ability to regroup in safe havens along the porous Afghanistan-Pakistan border made it difficult to sustain progress. Moreover, the increased military presence only intensified local resentment in certain areas, as many civilians viewed the foreign forces as occupying forces rather than protectors. This made winning the hearts and minds of the Afghan population a difficult and slow process. The shift in strategies and the surge policies ultimately highlighted the complexity of the war in Afghanistan. While the surge provided temporary tactical advantages, it underscored the limitations of purely military solutions in a conflict with deep-rooted political, social, and ethnic complexities. The challenges of governance, corruption, and the resilience of the insurgency proved that lasting peace could not be achieved through military force alone. Public opinion and political debates. As the war in Afghanistan continued, public opinion and political debates in the United States and other coalition countries began to play a significant role in shaping the direction of the conflict. Initially, there was strong support for military action in Afghanistan following the September 11 attacks, with many viewing the intervention as necessary to dismantle al-Qaeda and remove the Taliban from power. However, as the years went on and the conflict dragged on with no clear end in sight, public sentiment began to shift. By the mid-2000s, Americans and people in NATO countries started questioning the effectiveness and cost of the war. This was particularly evident as the number of casualties continued to rise, both among military personnel and Afghan civilians. News coverage of the ongoing violence, combined with the rising cost of the war in terms of both lives and financial resources, led to increasing skepticism. Many began to feel that the mission had strayed far from its original goals and was now a long, drawn-out engagement with no clear path to victory. In the US, political debates about the war intensified, especially during election cycles. Presidential candidates, particularly in the 2008 and 2012 elections, found it necessary to address the issue of Afghanistan as part of their foreign policy platforms. President Barack Obama's campaign in 2008, for example, focused heavily on a promise to refocus attention on the war in Afghanistan after the Iraq War had diverted resources. Obama's commitment to a surge in Afghanistan, while aimed at stabilizing the country, was met with both support and opposition. Critics argued that the US was becoming entrenched in an unwinnable war, while supporters contended that failure to stabilize Afghanistan would allow terrorist groups to regroup and spread instability. Public opinion was also influenced by the perception of the war's progress. With limited successes in defeating the Taliban, the continued resurgence of insurgent forces, and the slow development of the Afghan government and military, many began to see the war as an unwinnable conflict. The lack of a clear strategy for post-conflict reconstruction, along with growing corruption within the Afghan government, further eroded trust in the mission. Internationally, public opinion in NATO countries began to shift as well, with rising anti-war sentiment in countries like the United Kingdom, Canada, and Germany. Citizens in these countries, many of whom had lost soldiers in the conflict, began to demand an end to their involvement in Afghanistan. This put pressure on their governments to reconsider their roles in the war and explore options for withdrawal. The debate over the war in Afghanistan ultimately became a central issue in discussions about U.S. foreign policy and military engagement in the 21st century. The shifting public opinion highlighted the difficulties of sustaining a prolonged military operation and underscored the challenges of balancing national security interests with the public's desire for peace and a clear exit strategy. Conclusion. The war in Afghanistan, which began as a response to the September 11th attacks, evolved into one of the longest and most complex military engagements in U.S. history. What was initially a swift and decisive operation, aimed at dismantling al-Qaeda and removing the Taliban from power, quickly became a protracted conflict that spanned nearly 2 decades. Throughout this long period, the mission expanded, strategies shifted, and countless challenges emerged, both on the battlefield and in the political, humanitarian, and reconstruction efforts. Despite the initial successes, the war in Afghanistan exposed the limitations of military force in achieving long-term stability in a country with deep-rooted ethnic divisions, a history of warlordism, and a fragile political system. The rise of the Taliban insurgency, combined with the complex dynamics of Afghan society, proved that simply defeating an enemy on the battlefield was insufficient for building a sustainable peace. The US and NATO forces faced a difficult balancing act, securing the population, building institutions, and rebuilding infrastructure while simultaneously combating a resilient insurgency. As the years went by, the war's costs, both in terms of lives lost and financial resources spent, mounted, and the lack of a clear path to victory raised questions about the effectiveness of the mission. Public opinion in many coalition countries, especially the US, turned increasingly critical, with calls for a more defined exit strategy and a reassessment of the broader objectives. The challenges of governance and corruption within the Afghan government, compounded by the persistent security threats from the Taliban and other insurgent groups, hindered efforts to stabilize the country. While there were some notable successes, such as improvements in education and healthcare, the long-term impact of these efforts remained uncertain, given the volatile security environment. Ultimately, the war in Afghanistan was a reminder of the complexities of modern warfare, particularly in regions with entrenched social, political, and cultural issues. While the initial objectives of the mission were achieved, disrupting al-Qaeda and removing the Taliban, long-term peace and stability proved elusive. As the conflict unfolded, it underscored the importance of comprehensive strategies that go beyond military action to include diplomatic, economic, and cultural dimensions in efforts to rebuild and stabilize nations emerging from conflict. The conclusion of the war, with the eventual withdrawal of US and NATO forces in 2021, marked the end of a long chapter in both Afghanistan's history and global geopolitics. It left behind important lessons about the challenges of nation building, the consequences of military intervention, and the need for a broader, more inclusive approach to conflict resolution.